Hello there and welcome. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Adjust your pillow, let your body settle into whatever position feels right. There's no rush. We have all the time in the world. Where in the world are you watching from? A quiet bedroom as the night deepens, a cozy corner where the weight of the day is finally lifting. Wherever you are, you're exactly where you need to be. Tonight we're going to explore something remarkable. How a small city built on waterlogged land, a place where people lived below sea level and fought the ocean daily, became the financial capital of the entire world in the 1600s. We'll discover how Amsterdam's merchants invented the stock market, created the first modern corporation, and built financial instruments we still use today. We'll walk the canals, visit the exchange, meet the traders and sailors and bankers who transformed global commerce. And we'll do it slowly, carefully, letting the story unfold like a long conversation between old friends. If you enjoy these calm explorations of financial history, a like and subscribe really helps reach others seeking the same peaceful way to end their day. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being part of this community, so settle in. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears, take a slow breath, in through your nose, out through your mouth. And let's begin our slow drift through the canals of Amsterdam, through the counting houses and the ships and the innovations that change the world. There's nowhere you need to be, no deadlines to meet. Just listen and let the story wash over you. If you drift away, that's perfectly fine. That's what we're here for. Let's begin in 1600, when the world was changing. The Dutch Republic was young, barely 2 decades old as a truly independent state, though the war with Spain that would finally confirm that independence wouldn't officially end for another 48 years. The northern Netherlands, what we now call Holland, though that was technically just one province among 7, had declared itself free from Spanish rule in 1579 with the Union of Utrecht. But freedom, as the Dutch discovered, was one thing, survival was another, and prosperity, that required something more. Picture the land itself, because geography explains so much of what would follow. The northern Netherlands was not promising territory for building an empire. Much of it lay below sea level. The sea was not a distant threat, but an immediate constant presence. At high tide, water pressed against the dikes. During storms, waves crashed over barriers that were all that stood between the cities and inundation. The land the Dutch lived on was land they had stolen from the sea foot by foot, acre by acre, through back-breaking effort that never ended. They called these reclaimed lands polders. Imagine the process. First, you build a dike around a section of shallow sea or marsh. Then you use windmills, hundreds of windmills, their arms turning endlessly to pump out the water. The mills lift water from one level to another, sometimes in stages, until finally it can be drained away to rivers or canals. What remains is land, rich and fertile but requiring constant vigilance. Stop pumping and the sea returns. Let a dike weaken and everything floods. The Dutch learned early that their survival depended on collective action, on maintaining the pumps and dikes together. Because one person's failure could drown an entire community. This geography shaped Dutch character and eventually Dutch commerce. They became the world's masters of engineering and cooperation. They learned to plan methodically, to maintain systems carefully, to trust that if everyone did their part, safety was possible. These weren't particularly romantic lessons, but they were practical, and the Dutch were nothing if not practical. Amsterdam itself sat at the junction of the Amstel River and an inlet called the IJ. It had been a fishing village once, nothing special, but by 1600 it was transforming into something unprecedented. Picture narrow houses, 4 or 5 stories tall, pressed tightly together along canals. The houses were narrow because property taxes were based on street frontage. Another example of Dutch practicality shaping physical space. Each house had a gable hoist at the top, a beam and pulley system for lifting goods to upper floor storerooms, because the steep staircases inside were too narrow for carrying large items. The canals were not decorative. They were transportation networks, ways to move goods through a city built on soft, marshy ground where wheeled vehicles struggled. Boats glided between warehouses, carrying grain from the Baltic, spices from the East Indies, wine from France, timber from Scandinavia. The canals smelled of tar and salt in distant places. They reflected the sky and the narrow house fronts, creating a city that seemed to float, substantial and insubstantial at once. The people who lived in this watery city were as distinctive as the place itself. The Dutch Republic had no king, no hereditary nobility with vast estates and ancient privileges. Oh, there were wealthy families certainly, and some called themselves nobles, but political power rested with merchants and town councils. The stadtholders, military commanders, often from the House of Orange, had influence, but they weren't absolute monarchs. Real power belonged to the regents, the wealthy merchants who governed the cities and the provinces. This republican system was unusual in 17th century Europe, where divine right of kings was still the dominant political theory. The Dutch had stumbled into republicanism partly by necessity. They'd rebelled against a king and decided they didn't want another one, and partly because their economy depended on trade, and merchants wanted political systems that served commercial interests rather than aristocratic ones. The merchant class that ran Amsterdam was intensely focused on business. They rose early, worked long days in their counting houses, tracked accounts precisely, honoured contracts scrupulously. They were Calvinists mostly, Protestants who'd broken from the Catholic Church and who brought to commerce the same serious-minded attention they brought to religion. There's a famous Protestant work ethic that historians debate, but whether Calvinism caused capitalism or capitalism attracted Calvinists, the result in Amsterdam was a city almost entirely devoted to making money through trade. But Amsterdam had another characteristic that would prove crucial: tolerance. Not tolerance in a modern sense. The Dutch could be quite harsh about many things, but tolerance in a specific practical sense. They didn't care much what you believed or where you came from, as long as you followed the law and contributed to commerce. This was partly principle and partly self-interest. Persecuted groups brought skills and capital. Jews fleeing Spain and Portugal, Protestants fleeing Catholic countries, entrepreneurs fleeing restrictive guilds elsewhere, they all found Amsterdam relatively welcoming, and they all contributed to the city's economic dynamism. Religious tolerance had economic advantages that were immediately obvious. When Antwerp, the great commercial city of the southern Netherlands, fell to Spanish forces in 1585, many of its merchants fled north to Amsterdam. These refugees brought capital, commercial contacts, and expertise. Suddenly Amsterdam had experienced traders, established relationships with markets across Europe, and money to invest. The city's economy, already growing, accelerated. The physical expansion of Amsterdam in these years was dramatic. New canals were dug in concentric rings around the old medieval centre. The famous Grachtengordel, the canal belt of the Herengracht, Keizersgracht and Prinsengracht, was planned and begun in 1613, a massive expansion that would take decades to complete. These new canals were wider than the old ones, the houses grander. Wealthy merchants built along the Herengracht, creating the Golden Bend where the richest and most beautiful houses stood. These weren't palaces. The Dutch didn't do palaces, but they were substantial, elegant expressions of merchant wealth. The working city thrived alongside the wealthy districts. The Jordaan, west of the canal ring, was where artisans and workers lived. Breweries operated there. Amsterdam had dozens of breweries, producing beer that was safer to drink than water, and essential for long sea voyages. Shipyards lined the eastern waterfront, where workers built the ships that would make Dutch commerce possible. The sounds of hammering, sawing, and caulking filled the air. The smell of tar and hemp and fresh-cut timber mixed with the ever-present smell of canal water. The eastern islands, newly created from reclaimed land, became centres of maritime industry. Warehouses stored goods from around the world. Rope walks stretched for hundreds of feet. where workers twisted hemp into the miles of rope every ship required. Sail lofts employed sewers who stitched the vast expanses of canvas that caught the wind. Every trade related to shipping found space in Amsterdam because shipping was what Amsterdam did. Consider the herring fishery, because it laid the foundation for everything that followed. Herring doesn't sound like the basis of an empire, but for the Dutch it was. North Sea herring were abundant, nutritious, and when properly preserved could be stored and transported long distances. The Dutch developed a technique for preserving herring at sea, gutting the fish in a particular way, packing them in brine in barrels, that allowed fishing boats to stay out longer and bring back larger catches that would keep for months. The herring busses, as the fishing boats were called, were substantial vessels with crews of a dozen or more. They fished the North Sea in vast fleets, sometimes hundreds of ships working the same waters. The annual arrival of the first herring catch was celebrated in Amsterdam with ceremony and feasting. The first barrel was often presented to important officials. This wasn't just tradition. Herring was serious business. It fed the population, employed thousands, and was exported across northern Europe. Polish peasants ate Dutch herring. German armies marched on Dutch herring. The profits from herring-funded ships, trading voyages, and eventually the more glamorous trades in spices and silks. But herring alone wouldn't make Amsterdam a financial capital. For that, you needed the carrying trade, and for the carrying trade you needed ships. Not just any ships, but ships that were cheap to build, cheap to operate, and efficient to sail. And here the Dutch made one of those practical innovations that changed everything. The ship was called a vloot, or in English, a flyboat, though it wasn't particularly fast. The vloot emerged in the 1590s, probably designed by shipbuilders in Hoorn, another Dutch port, though Amsterdam's yards quickly adopted and refined the design. It looked ungainly compared to sleek warships or elegant merchant vessels from other nations. The vloot was wide and flat-bottomed with a rounded hull that bulged out like a barrel. It had a narrow stern and a flat, almost straight prow. It was, essentially, a floating warehouse optimized for cargo capacity and economy. The brilliance of the vloot was in the details. The flat bottom allowed it to carry more cargo and to navigate shallow Dutch ports. The rounded hull maximized interior volume. The narrow deck and stern reduced the tonnage calculations that many ports used for fees. The Dutch had literally designed the ship to minimize port charges. Most importantly, the vloot was designed to be sailed with a minimal crew. Where a comparable English or French merchant ship might require 30 sailors, a vloot could be managed with 10 or 12. Labour was the largest operating cost for merchant ships. Cut your crew by 2/3 and you could charge much lower freight rates than your competitors. Dutch shipbuilders produced these ships in remarkable numbers and at remarkable prices. Amsterdam's yards could build a vloot in a few months. They used standardized designs, prefabricated components, and efficient production methods that we might recognize as proto-industrial. A Dutch merchant could buy a vloot for perhaps 40 or 50% less than a comparable ship would cost in England or France. And because labour costs were lower, he could operate it more cheaply too. The result was that Dutch ships came to dominate the carrying trade of Europe. If you were a Polish grain merchant wanting to ship wheat to Portugal, you hired a Dutch ship because it was cheapest. If you were a Portuguese wine merchant sending wine to the Baltic, Dutch ships offered the best rates. The Dutch became the middlemen of European commerce, carrying other people's goods between other people's ports and making a profit on each voyage. Amsterdam became the central hub of this carrying trade. Ships departed for the Baltic to fetch grain, timber and naval stores, tar, pitch, hemp for rope, tall trees for masts. They sailed to France for wine and salt. They went to Portugal and Spain for fruit, wine and access to colonial goods. They travelled to England for wool and cloth, and they brought everything back to Amsterdam, where goods were stored in vast warehouses, sorted, sometimes processed, and then re-exported to wherever demand existed. This is what merchants called the entrepot function, and Amsterdam perfected it. the city became a staple market, a place where particular goods were customarily traded. If you wanted to buy Baltic grain in large quantities, you went to Amsterdam. If you needed Scandinavian timber, Amsterdam's merchants could supply it. This concentration of trade created efficiencies. Buyers knew they could find sellers in Amsterdam. Sellers knew they could find buyers. Information flowed through the city. News of harvests, wars, price changes, and distant markets. That information itself became valuable. The physical infrastructure supported this trade. Amsterdam's warehouses lined the canals and filled the eastern islands. Some belonged to individual merchants, but many were public warehouses operated by the city, available for rent. Goods could be stored safely, insured against fire and theft, and easily accessed when buyers appeared. The city maintained accurate weights and measures, preventing the kind of fraud that plagued trade elsewhere. Amsterdam's reputation for honest dealing was itself a competitive advantage. The people who made this system work were as varied as the goods they traded. Ship captains who'd spent their lives at sea, who knew every current and hazard of the Baltic or the route to the Mediterranean. Merchants who sat in counting houses surrounded by ledgers, tracking shipments and prices, writing letters to correspondents across Europe. Warehousemen who knew their stock precisely, could locate any barrel or bale, understood the qualities and grades of hundreds of commodities. Dock workers who loaded and unloaded ships, strong men who worked in gangs, passing cargo from ship to shore and shore to warehouse in human chains. Women participated too, though in different ways. Widows often continued their late husbands' businesses. Some women owned shares in ships or trading ventures. In the markets, women bought and sold, haggled and traded. The Dutch were practical about such things. If a woman could manage a business profitably, religious or social strictures against women in commerce were conveniently overlooked. The city's governance reflected its commercial character. Amsterdam's city council, made up of wealthy merchants, maintained the infrastructure that trade required. They dredged channels, repaired dikes, regulated markets, enforced contracts. They understood that their own wealth depended on Amsterdam's functioning as an efficient commercial centre. When the city needed to borrow money for improvements, they borrowed it, knowing that the increased trade would generate tax revenues to pay it back. This was governance as business management, and it worked. By 1600, Amsterdam was prosperous, but it wasn't yet the financial capital of the world. It was a successful trading city, similar in many ways to Antwerp a generation earlier, or Venice in its prime. What would transform Amsterdam from a commercial hub into something entirely new was about to happen. A group of merchants, frustrated with competition and inspired by possibility, were planning something unprecedented. They were going to create a company unlike any that had existed before, a company whose shares could be bought and sold, whose capital would be permanent, whose scale would be global. They were going to create the world's first modern corporation. But we'll come to that slowly in its own time. For now, picture Amsterdam in these early years of the 1600s, busy, prosperous, ambitious, and on the edge of inventing the future of finance. Let's talk about spices, because to understand what happened next in Amsterdam, we need to understand what drove men to sail for months across dangerous seas, what made merchants willing to risk everything, what created profits so extraordinary that they would reshape how business itself worked. Pepper, nutmeg, cloves, mace, cinnamon. These weren't luxuries in the way we think of luxuries today. They were essential to European cuisine and medicine, preservatives that made food palatable, ingredients that demonstrated status and wealth. A pound of nutmeg in 1600 could cost more than a cow. The spices grew only in specific places, mostly islands in what is now Indonesia, thousands of miles from Europe. The Moluccas, the fabled Spice Islands, were the only place on Earth where cloves and nutmeg grew naturally. Control those islands and you controlled immense wealth. For most of the 1500s, the Portuguese had controlled the spice trade. They'd pioneered the sea route around Africa to the Indies, established fortified trading posts, and maintained a monopoly through force and secrecy. Spanish and Portuguese ships brought spices to Lisbon, and from there they were distributed across Europe. The Dutch, like other northern Europeans, had to buy their spices from Iberian middlemen, paying whatever prices were demanded. But in 1580, the political situation changed. Philip II of Spain inherited the Portuguese crown, uniting the two Iberian kingdoms. Philip was also the king the Dutch were rebelling against, the monarch they'd declared independence from. Suddenly, Dutch merchants couldn't buy spices in Lisbon anymore. They were trading with the enemy. This created both crisis and opportunity. If the Dutch wanted spices, they'd have to go get them themselves. The first Dutch voyage to the Indies departed in 1595. 4 ships under Cornelis de Houtman, with 249 men, sailed south along the African coast, around the Cape of Good Hope, across the Indian Ocean to Java. The voyage was a disaster by most measures. It took 2 years. 2/3 of the crew died from scurvy, disease, and conflicts with local rulers. The spices they brought back barely covered the voyage's costs, but they proved it could be done. The Portuguese monopoly could be broken. More voyages followed. Each one was organised as a separate venture. Merchants would band together, pool their capital, outfit ships, hire crew, and send them east. If the ships returned safely, the profits were divided among the investors according to their shares. If the ships were lost, and many were, the investors lost everything. It was extraordinarily risky, but the potential returns were staggering. A successful voyage might return 400 or 500% profit. The problem was competition. Multiple Dutch companies were sending ships to the Indies, sometimes arriving at the same ports at the same time. They bid against each other for spices, driving prices up. They competed for local alliances, sometimes undercutting each other. They duplicated expenses, each company maintaining its own warehouses, ships, and fortifications. And because each voyage was a separate venture that liquidated when ships returned, there was no continuity, no long-term planning, no permanent presence in the Indies. Johan van Oldenbarneveld, the Grand Pensionary of Holland, essentially the chief executive of the province, saw the inefficiency. He understood that if the Dutch were to truly challenge Portuguese dominance, they needed unity, scale, and permanence. He began negotiating among the competing companies, urging them to merge, to create a single organisation that could coordinate the Dutch effort in the Indies. The negotiations took years. Merchants from different cities had different interests. Amsterdam's traders competed with companies from Rotterdam, Hoorn, Enkhuizen, Delft, and Middelburg. Each city wanted to protect its own merchants' interests. But slowly, through a combination of persuasion and pressure from the States General, the Republic's governing body, agreement emerged. On March 20th, 1602, the States General granted a charter to a new entity, the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, the United East India Company. In Dutch, the initials were VOC, and that's how everyone referred to it. The VOC wasn't just a merger of existing companies, it was something new, something unprecedented in scale and structure. Let's understand what made the VOC revolutionary, because this is where modern corporate finance begins. Previous trading ventures, including the earlier Dutch voyages to the Indies, had been organised as temporary partnerships. Investors put up money for a specific voyage. When the ships returned, the partnership was dissolved, goods were sold and profits distributed. Then, if you wanted to fund another voyage, you organised a new partnership. This voyage-by-voyage structure made sense for short ventures, but it created problems for trade with the Indies. A voyage to the Indies took 2 years minimum, often longer. Ships needed to be built or bought, provisioned for months at sea, armed against pirates and rivals. Once in the Indies, the company needed warehouses, trading posts, sometimes fortifications. They needed to cultivate relationships with local rulers, which took time. They needed to maintain a presence, not just arrive, buy spices and leave. All of this required capital that would be tied up for years, and it required planning beyond a single voyage. The VOC solution was permanent capital. Investors would buy shares in the company, but the company wouldn't liquidate after each voyage. The capital would remain permanently invested. The company would use it to buy ships, establish posts, maintain operations continuously. Investors wouldn't get their capital back by dissolving the partnership. Instead, if they wanted to exit, they could sell their shares to someone else. This might not sound revolutionary, but it was. It meant that the VOC could make long-term investments, could build permanent infrastructure, could operate as an ongoing concern rather than a series of disconnected ventures. It also meant that investors' commitment was different. They were buying into an enterprise, not a voyage. The risk was spread across all the company's activities rather than concentrated in a few ships on a single journey. The VOC was capitalized at 6.5 million guilders, an enormous sum for the time. To put that in perspective, the annual tax revenue of the entire Dutch Republic was roughly 5 million guilders. The VOC's initial capital exceeded the government's annual budget. This capital was raised by selling shares to anyone who wanted to buy them. You could invest as little as 3,000 guilders, or as much as you could afford. Wealthy merchants bought large blocks of shares, of course, but so did smaller merchants, artisans, shopkeepers, even servants who'd saved some money. Women could own shares. Orphanages and charitable institutions invested their endowments in VOC stock. The company's shares were spread among thousands of investors across the Dutch Republic. This was equity ownership on a scale that had never existed before. The company was headquartered in Amsterdam in a building called the Oost-Indisch Huis, the East India House, on Cloveniersburg-Waal. It was a substantial structure, appropriate for an organization managing global operations. Inside, clerks maintained ledgers tracking ships, cargoes, expenses, and revenues. Directors, the Heren Inventian, the 17 gentlemen, representing the different chambers of the company, met to make decisions about voyages, trade, and strategy. The VOC's charter granted it extraordinary powers. It could negotiate treaties with foreign rulers, build fortresses, maintain armies and navies, install governors, coin money, and exercise judicial authority. These were powers that normally belonged to sovereign states, but they'd been delegated to a commercial company. The VOC was a corporation, yes, but it was also a quasi-government pursuing Dutch interests in Asia through commercial means backed by military force. The ships the VOC sent east were called East Indiamen. Larger and more heavily armed than ordinary merchant vessels, they needed to be. The voyage covered thousands of miles of dangerous water. Pirates operated in the narrow straits. Portuguese warships attacked Dutch interlopers. Storms in the southern Indian Ocean could last for weeks. Disease killed crew by the dozens. Imagine the journey. A VOC ship departing Amsterdam would sail north around Scotland to avoid the English Channel, where Spanish and English ships might interfere, then south along the European and African coasts, stopping at the Cape Verde Islands for water and provisions. Further south to the equator, through the doldrums where wind failed and ships sat motionless for days. Then southeast toward the Cape of Good Hope at Africa's southern tip, where the Atlantic and Indian Oceans meet in some of the roughest seas on Earth. Rounding the Cape required skill and luck. Ships fought westerly gales, massive waves, cold that froze rigging and numbed hands. Some ships were lost here, smashed against rocks or simply overwhelmed by seas. Those that survived continued northeast across the Indian Ocean toward Java. If winds were favourable, this crossing took weeks. If not, it could take months. Men died of scurvy, dysentery, typhus. Bodies were wrapped in canvas and slipped overboard with brief prayers. Finally, after 6, 8, 10 months at sea, Java appeared on the horizon. The VOC established its Asian headquarters at Batavia, modern Jakarta, on Java's northwestern coast. Jan Petersoen Cohen, one of the early governors-general, built Batavia into a fortified city that served as the hub for VOC operations throughout Asia. From Batavia, smaller ships sailed to the Spice Islands, to the Moluccas for cloves and nutmeg, to Ceylon for cinnamon, to India for pepper and textiles. The VOC didn't just buy spices and bring them home. It engaged in intra-Asian trade, buying goods in one Asian port and selling them in another. Chinese silks and porcelain were bought in Taiwan or the Chinese coast and sold in Japan. Indian textiles were sold throughout Southeast Asia. This regional trade was often more profitable than the direct spice trade to Europe, and it generated capital that could be used to buy more spices. The violence involved in this trade is something we should acknowledge. The VOC used force routinely. When the population of the Banda Islands resisted VOC monopoly on nutmeg, Cohen conducted a campaign of extermination, killing or enslaving most of the population and replacing them with Dutch colonists and imported slaves. The VOC destroyed spice trees on islands it didn't control to maintain scarcity and high prices. It fought wars against local rulers, against the Portuguese, against English rivals. The profits Amsterdam's merchants enjoyed came, in part, from exploitation and violence half a world away. Back in Amsterdam, the spices arrived after journeys of 2 years or more. The returning East India men were met with celebration. Warehouses on the eastern islands received the cargo: pepper by the thousands of pounds, nutmeg and mace, cloves that filled the air with their distinctive scent, cinnamon bark, exotic woods, Chinese porcelain, Indian textiles. These goods were inventoried, stored, and then sold at auction. The auctions were major events. Merchants from across Europe attended. Prices depended on supply, on how many ships had returned that year, on what was happening in European markets. A glut of pepper might depress prices. A shortage of cloves might drive them up. The VOC learned to manage supply, to store spices and release them gradually rather than flooding the market. The profits, when they came, were substantial. Early VOC dividends were paid partly in cash and partly in spices, which shareholders could then sell themselves. In 1610, the company paid a dividend of 75%. If you'd invested 100 guilders, you received 75 guilders back. In 1620, the dividend was 50%. These weren't annual returns, they were occasional distributions when the company had surplus cash. But they demonstrated that the VOC was immensely profitable. And here's where something subtle but crucial happened. Because the VOC's capital was permanent, because investors couldn't demand their money back, a market developed for the shares themselves. If you owned VOC shares and wanted to cash out, you could sell them to someone else. The company didn't buy them back, the capital remained with the VOC, but ownership transferred. At first, these share transfers happened informally. A merchant wanting to sell shares would mention it to colleagues, would find a buyer, and they'd complete the transaction in a notary's office. But gradually a more organised market emerged. Share trading happened in the courtyard of the Amsterdam Exchange, the Beurs, where merchants already gathered to trade commodities and exchange commercial information. The VOC share became the world's first publicly traded stock. It wasn't called a stock then. The Dutch term was actie, action or share. But that's what it was. And because the shares could be freely traded, their price fluctuated based on what buyers were willing to pay. The price reflected expectations about the VOC's future profits, about conditions in the Indies, about competition and political developments. Within a few years of the VOC's founding, a functioning stock market existed in Amsterdam. People bought and sold shares not just to invest in the company, but to speculate on price movements. Some investors bought shares hoping the price would rise so they could sell at a profit. Others developed more sophisticated strategies. You could sell shares you didn't own, short selling, if you believed the price would fall. You could buy options, contracts giving you the right but not the obligation to buy or sell shares at a specified price at a future date. These financial innovations emerged organically from the basic structure of the VOC, permanent capital, transferable shares, and a marketplace where trading happened. Nobody planned to create a stock market. It emerged because investors needed a way to value and exchange shares, and Amsterdam's merchants, practical as always, figured out how to do it. The Amsterdam Exchange Bank, which we'll explore more deeply shortly, facilitated share trading by providing a means to transfer payment. The physical shares were certificates, pieces of paper recording ownership, but tracking ownership changes required record keeping. The VOC maintained a ledger of shareholders. When shares were sold, both buyer and seller had to appear at the company's office to record the transfer. This was cumbersome, but it worked. The culture around share trading developed quickly. Merchants gathered at certain times of day at the exchange. News about arriving ships, about events in the Indies, about political developments that might affect trade, all of it fed into share price movements. A rumour that a fleet had been lost might send prices down. Confirmed news of a rich cargo arriving sent prices up. The price of VOC shares became a barometer of Amsterdam's commercial confidence. Joseph de la Vega, a merchant and writer whom we'll meet properly later, described the psychology of share trading. He wrote about the bulls, investors who believed prices would rise and bought accordingly. He wrote about the bears, who believed prices would fall and sold. He described the tension of watching prices move, the temptation to buy or sell at the wrong moment, the difficulty of separating sound analysis from emotion and rumour. The VOC itself was ambivalent about share trading. Company directors believed shareholders should invest for the long term, should care about the company's operations and profits, not just about share price fluctuations. They complained that speculators made the market unstable, that rumours and manipulation distorted the true value of the company. But they couldn't control it. The shares were out in the world, owned by thousands of people, and those people could do with them as they wished. By 1620, the VOC was the largest corporation in the world. It operated dozens of ships, maintained posts from the Cape of Good Hope to Japan, employed thousands of sailors, soldiers, and administrators, and conducted trade worth millions of guilders annually. Its shares were the most widely held security in existence, owned by investors across the Dutch Republic and even beyond. The VOC would continue for nearly 200 years, until 1799 when it was finally dissolved. Through that long history, it would be enormously profitable at times, and troubled at others. It would engage in trade and in conquest, in commerce and in colonialism. Its legacy is complex, to say the least. It helped create modern corporate structures and global capitalism. But it did so through violence and exploitation. For Amsterdam, the VOC meant wealth flowing into the city on an unprecedented scale. Merchants who invested early became rich. Workers who built the ships, processed the goods, and managed the trade found employment. The city's tax revenues from VOC-related activities helped fund the expansion of Amsterdam, the building of new canals and grand houses. The VOC made Amsterdam important not just as a trading centre, but as a financial centre, a place where capital could be raised and deployed on a global scale. And the innovations kept coming. The VOC demonstrated that a corporation with permanent capital could function effectively, could operate across vast distances and long-time horizons. It showed that shares in such a corporation could be freely traded, creating liquidity for investors while leaving capital with the company. It proved that thousands of small investors could own a large enterprise together, spreading risk and enabling scale that no individual or partnership could match. These insights, emerging from the practical needs of the spice trade and the inventiveness of Amsterdam's merchants, would reshape finance and commerce everywhere. The English would copy the model with their own East India Company. Joint stock corporations would spread to other industries. Stock markets would emerge in London, Paris, and eventually across the world. The modern economy of publicly traded corporations, of stock markets and shareholders, of separating ownership from management. All of it traces back to Amsterdam in the early 1600s, to the VOC and the market for its shares. But for now, in those early years, it was still new, still unfolding, still discovering what was possible when capital became permanent and his shares became tradable. The merchants walking through the Burr courtyard, checking share prices, discussing the latest news from Batavia, they were inventing the future one transaction at a time, building the architecture of global capitalism through countless individual decisions to buy and sell and trade. And Amsterdam, that waterlogged city that shouldn't have amounted to much, was becoming the place where the world's money lived. The VOC had solved one problem: how to raise and deploy capital for long-distance trade, but in doing so it had created another. All those share transactions, all that trade in commodities and bills of exchange, required payment, and payment. In the early 1600s was more complicated than you might imagine. Money itself was a problem. There was no single currency, no standardized coinage that everyone trusted equally. Gold and silver coins circulated certainly, but they came from many different sources. Spanish silver, German thalers, English shillings, French livres, and dozens of local Dutch coins all mixed together in commerce. Each had a different weight of precious metal, a different purity, a different official value. A merchant receiving payment had to assess each coin individually. Was it genuine? Had it been clipped, with edges shaved off to steal the silver? Had it been debased by a government mixing base metals with the silver? The practice of debasing currency was common throughout Europe. A government short of money would recall its coins, melt them down, add copper or other cheap metals to the silver, and reissue more coins with the same face value, but less actual silver content. This created profit for the government, but destroyed trust in the currency. Over time, as debasement continued, the coins became worth less and less in terms of the silver they actually contained. Governments also quote zero or quote one their currencies, declaring by proclamation that coins would now be worth more or less than before. A coin worth 1 guilder yesterday might be proclaimed worth 1 guilder and 10 stuvers today. This was supposed to be monetary policy, but it created chaos. Merchants never knew what their money would be worth tomorrow. Foreign traders demanded payment in specific coins they trusted, or in commodities, or in bills of exchange drawn on reliable banks elsewhere. Amsterdam's merchant community faced this monetary chaos daily. A buyer and seller might agree on a price, but then had to negotiate what that price meant in actual coins. Which coins were acceptable? At what exchange rate? Would the buyer provide good, full-weight silver, or would he try to pass off clipped or debased coins? Every transaction required assessment, negotiation, sometimes actual weighing and testing of coins. This inefficiency was intolerable for a trading centre of Amsterdam's scale. Thousands of transactions happened daily. Ships arrived with cargoes to be paid for. Bills of exchange needed to be settled. Share transfers required payment. The time and effort spent evaluating and negotiating about coins was time not spent on productive commerce. Amsterdam needed a solution, and the city's governors understood this. The solution was the Wisselbank, the Amsterdam Exchange Bank, founded on January 31st, 1609. The Wisselbank was a municipal bank, owned and operated by the city of Amsterdam. It was housed in the old town hall, a substantial building on the dam, the central square. The bank occupied rooms on the ground floor, secure and accessible. The Wisselbank's innovation was elegantly simple. It created a new form of money, bank money, that existed only as entries in the bank's ledgers. Here's how it worked. A merchant would bring coins to the bank. The bank would assess them, determine their actual metal content regardless of what face value was stamped on them, and credit the merchant's account with that value in bank money. The bank money was denominated in guilders and stivers, but it was standardized, always representing a fixed quantity of precious metal. Once you had bank money in your account, You could transfer it to someone else simply by going to the bank with the recipient and instructing the clerk to make the transfer. The clerk would debit your account and credit theirs. No physical coins changed hands. The transaction was recorded in the bank's ledgers, and it was final. The bank money itself was more trusted than any physical coin because it represented verified, standardized value. For international trade, this was revolutionary. An Amsterdam merchant buying goods from a merchant in Hamburg could pay by transferring bank money. The Hamburg merchant knew the bank money represented actual, standardized value, not debased coins or uncertain exchange rates. Settlement was instant and certain. No need to ship coins across distances, risking loss or theft. No need to negotiate exchange rates on every transaction. The bank charged a small fee for maintaining accounts and for transfers, but the efficiency it created was worth far more than the fees. Merchants flocked to use the whistle bank. Within a few years, the city mandated that bills of exchange above a certain value had to be settled through the bank. This wasn't oppressive regulation. Merchants wanted to use the bank because it made their lives easier. The bank money quickly commanded a premium over physical coins. This premium was called the agio. Bank money might trade at a 2 or 3 or even 5% premium to the same nominal value in physical coins. Why? Because it was more trusted, more convenient, more stable. The agio fluctuated based on supply and demand, but its existence proved that the market valued the bank's standardization and reliability. The whistle bank was conservative in its operations, and this conservatism was itself an innovation. The bank didn't lend out the money deposited with it, or at least not much. It maintained reserves of actual metal to back the bank money it had created. The bank's accounts were public and were regularly audited. Any citizen could inspect the ledgers. This transparency created trust. People believed the bank money was real because they could verify the bank wasn't creating it from nothing. This was different from banking practices elsewhere. In Venice and Genoa, banks did exist, and they did accept deposits and facilitate transfers, but they also lent money, and they sometimes failed when loans went bad. The Amsterdam Exchange Bank, by limiting its activities primarily to exchange and transfer services, avoided that risk. It was intentionally a boring bank, and boring in banking is often good. Let me describe the physical experience of using the bank, because these details matter. You'd enter the town hall, a grand civic building that announced Amsterdam's importance and wealth. The bank occupied rooms that were secure but not secretive. This was civic infrastructure, not private mystery. Clerks sat at desks with massive ledgers, bound volumes with heavy covers. When you wanted to make a transfer, you'd approach the counter with the person you were paying. The clerk would ask for your names, verify your identity. You had to be a known account holder and confirm the amount to be transferred. Then the clerk would open the relevant ledgers, dip a quill in ink, and make the entries. From your account, a debit. To the recipient's account, a credit. The clerk would read back the entries to confirm accuracy. Both parties would acknowledge the transaction, and it was done. The physical ledgers were the bank. There were no paper instruments representing bank money, no certificates you could carry away. Your bank money existed as numbers in the ledger. This might seem primitive compared to modern electronic banking, but it was actually quite advanced. The ledger was tamper-resistant. Any alteration would be obvious. It was permanent. You couldn't lose your bank money because it wasn't a physical thing to lose, and it was authoritative. The ledger was the definitive record of who owned what. The bank issued receipts, certainly, small notes confirming that a transfer had been made or that you'd deposited certain coins. But these receipts weren't the money itself. They were just records. The money was the ledger entry. This distinction mattered. Later, other banks would issue notes that circulated as money, essentially IOUs that passed from hand to hand. The Whistle Bank didn't do that. Its money stayed in the ledgers, secure and unchanging unless you authorized a transfer. The trust required for this system to work was substantial. You had to trust that the bank would maintain accurate ledgers. You had to trust that the city of Amsterdam, which operated the bank, wouldn't steal your money or debase the bank guilder. You had to trust that when you wanted to withdraw coins, which you could do exchanging bank money back for physical metal, the bank would have the reserves to accommodate you. Amsterdam's city government understood that this trust was fragile and precious. They treated the bank's integrity as a matter of civic survival. The bank's operations were supervised by commissioners drawn from the city council. The metal reserves were stored in secure vaults in the town hall. Periodic audits verified that the reserves matched the outstanding bank money. When rumours circulated that the bank might be in trouble, the authorities would open the vaults publicly to demonstrate the reserves existed. This transparency was unusual. Most banks guarded information about reserves and operations jealously. The Whistle Bank did the opposite, understanding that public confidence depended on public knowledge. If people could see that the bank was sound, they'd continue using it. If they had to wonder, doubt would creep in. The bank also established clear rules and stuck to them. The types of coins accepted, the methods for assessing value, the fees charged, the procedures for transfers, all were specified and followed consistently. This predictability created confidence. Merchants knew what to expect. There were no arbitrary decisions, no favoritism, no sudden changes in policy. Over time, the Whistle Bank became central to Amsterdam's commercial life. Nearly every significant merchant had an account. The bank's ledgers recorded thousands of transfers daily. The volume of commerce flowing through the bank's books represented a substantial portion of Amsterdam's total trade. The bank money became, in effect, Amsterdam's currency, more important than any physical coins. For foreign merchants trading with Amsterdam, having an account at the Whistle Bank became almost essential. If you wanted to buy goods in Amsterdam, sellers often insisted on payment in bank money. If you sold goods there, receiving payment in bank money was preferable to accepting uncertain coins. So merchants from across Europe opened accounts, often maintaining balances at the Whistle Bank to facilitate future transactions. This international use of the bank created network effects. The more people who used the Whistle Bank, the more useful it became. If only a few Amsterdam merchants used it, its benefits would be limited. But when thousands of merchants from across Europe all used it, it became the common platform for international trade settlement. This made Amsterdam more attractive as a trading centre, which brought more merchants, which made the bank more useful in a reinforcing cycle. The Whistle Bank's success inspired imitation. Other cities, Hamburg, Nuremberg, Venice, attempted similar institutions, but none achieved Amsterdam's success, partly because they lacked Amsterdam's commercial volume, and partly because they couldn't replicate the trust that Amsterdam's bank enjoyed. Trust, it turned out, wasn't just about institutional design. It was about reputation, consistency, and the broader context of Amsterdam's reliable commercial practices. The bank also facilitated the stock market that was developing around VOC shares. When shares were bought and sold, payment could be made through bank transfers. This was faster and more secure than paying in coins. The seller didn't have to worry about receiving clipped or counterfeit coins. The buyer didn't have to transport large amounts of metal. A share transaction could be settled in minutes with a visit to the bank. The combination of the VOC creating tradable shares and the Whistle Bank creating reliable money for settling trades. These two innovations reinforced each other. Together they made Amsterdam uniquely capable of handling complex financial transactions. Capital could be raised, deployed, traded and settled efficiently. This efficiency attracted more capital, more traders, more innovation. There's something profound here about the nature of money and trust. Money, at its core, is a social technology. It works because everyone agrees it works, because we trust that others will accept it in exchange for goods and services. Physical money, gold and silver coins, carries some intrinsic value, but even that depends on social agreement that gold and silver are valuable. Bank money, which has no physical existence, depends entirely on trust in the institution creating it. The Wisselbank succeeded because Amsterdam's government earned and maintained that trust. They didn't abuse the bank for short-term gain. They didn't inflate the money supply to finance wars. They didn't favour some merchants over others. They operated the bank as a public utility, boring and reliable and honest. This created an asset, monetary credibility, that was worth more than any amount of gold. Other governments watched Amsterdam's success with envy and incomprehension. Why couldn't they replicate it? Often the answer was that they couldn't resist the temptation to exploit monetary institutions for fiscal purposes. A king facing war expenses might debase the currency or force the bank to lend. A city government might use bank reserves to fund public works. These short-term expedients destroyed long-term trust. Amsterdam's Republican government, controlled by merchants who understood commerce, resisted these temptations. The Wisselbank was too valuable to risk. Its credibility was worth protecting, even when that meant forgoing opportunities to extract resources from it. This long-term thinking, this willingness to maintain institutions for their own sake, was part of what made Amsterdam different. By the 1620s and 30s, the Wisselbank was established as one of the pillars of Amsterdam's commercial dominance. Ships arrived from across the world, their cargoes were sold and the proceeds flowed through the bank's ledgers. Bills of exchange drawn on Amsterdam were accepted across Europe because everyone knew they could be settled reliably through the Wisselbank. The bankguilder became a unit of account used in international contracts even by parties who never set foot in Amsterdam. The bank's reserves grew to impressive size. Tons of gold and silver sat in the vaults beneath the town hall, backing the bank money circulating above. The metal itself was rarely moved. It sat, secure and audited, while the ledgers above recorded endless transfers of value. The metal was the foundation, but the ledgers were the active mechanism, the place where Amsterdam's commerce actually happened. There's a beautiful simplicity to the Wisselbank's design. It solved a real problem, currency chaos, with an elegant solution, standardized ledger money. It didn't try to do too much. It didn't engage in risky lending or speculation. It did one thing, did it well, and through doing that one thing reliably, became indispensable. This focus, this resistance to mission creep, helped it survive for nearly 2 centuries. The Wisselbank would eventually fail, but that was far in the future, in the late 1700s, when Amsterdam's commercial dominance had faded and the bank's conservative practices were abandoned. For the period we're exploring, through the 1600s, the bank was successful precisely because it remained true to its original limited purpose. As we move forward through Amsterdam's golden age, we'll see the Wisselbank operating in the background of every transaction, every innovation, every development in Amsterdam's financial markets. It was infrastructure, essential but often invisible, the foundation on which everything else was built. Like the dikes that held back the sea and the windmills that drained the polders, the Wisselbank was part of the collective effort that made Amsterdam possible, that turned a waterlogged city into a financial capital. And like those other infrastructures, it worked because the Dutch understood that their survival and prosperity depended on maintaining systems carefully, on thinking long-term, on building trust that would endure. The money flowing through the Wisselbank's ledgers had to come from somewhere, and for Amsterdam that somewhere was often the sea. While the VOC's spice trade captured imaginations with its exotic goods and spectacular profits, the foundation of Dutch commercial wealth was more prosaic. It was herring and timber, grain and salt, carried in ships that were marvels not of elegance but of efficiency. We touched on the herring fishery earlier, but let's explore it more fully, because it demonstrates the Dutch approach to commerce, finding an ordinary resource, applying technical innovation, and building an industry through systematic organisation. Herring swim in vast schools through the North Sea, migrating seasonally. They're nutritious, abundant, and when properly preserved, can feed people far from the coast. The Dutch didn't discover herring fishing, but they perfected it. The innovation was in preservation. Fresh herring spoil quickly, salted herring can last months, but the process matters enormously. The Dutch developed a technique called gibbing, gutting the fish in a specific way that removed the guts but left the pancreas, which contains enzymes that improve flavour during the curing process. The gibbed herring were then packed in barrels with salt in carefully calibrated proportions. Too much salt and the fish became unpalatable. Too little and they spoiled. This gibbing technique, supposedly invented by Willem Boykel-Zoon in the late 1300s, gave Dutch herring a superior taste and longer preservation than herring cured by other methods. And the Dutch did something clever. They performed the gibbing at sea, on the fishing boats themselves rather than waiting until they returned to port. This meant the herring were preserved while still fresh, improving quality. It also meant the boats could stay out longer, following the herring schools bringing back larger catches. The boats used for herring fishing were called busses, substantial vessels 50 to 70 feet long, with crews of 12 to 15 men. A herring bus was a floating factory. It had the nets and equipment for catching herring, the facilities and barrels for preserving them, and enough provisions to keep the crew at sea for weeks. The buses worked in fleets, sometimes hundreds of them fishing the same waters during the herring season. The annual departure of the herring fleet was a significant event. In late June or early July, when the herring were fat and full of flavour, the buses would sail from Dutch ports. They'd work the North Sea through summer and autumn, following the schools, catching and preserving. The first catch of the season, brought back by fast boats, was celebrated. Fresh herring was a delicacy, and the first barrel was often presented to civic authorities as a symbol of the season's beginning. The economic scale of the herring fishery was substantial. At its peak in the early 1600s, the Dutch herring fleet comprised over 400 buses employing thousands of sailors. The industry included not just the fishermen but the coopers who made barrels, the salt suppliers, the merchants who distributed the herring across Europe. Cities like Enkhuizen and Hoorn in North Holland were centres of the herring trade. Their economies built around the seasonal rhythm of the fishery. Herring fed Europe. Poor people across the continent ate Dutch herring regularly. It was affordable protein that kept through winter. Catholic dietary laws required fish on Fridays and during Lent, creating reliable demand. Armies marched on supplies that included barrels of Dutch herring. The humble fish, caught and preserved efficiently, generated steady profits that accumulated into substantial wealth. But herring was only one part of the Dutch maritime economy. The real foundation of Amsterdam's prosperity was what historians call the carrying trade, or the bulk trade, and it depended on the fleet, that ungainly but brilliant ship we mentioned earlier. Let's think about the fleet more carefully, because it represents a different kind of innovation than the dramatic breakthroughs we often celebrate. The fleet wasn't faster than other ships, it wasn't larger. It wasn't armed for combat. What it was cheap. Cheap to build, cheap to operate, and therefore able to charge lower freight rates than any competitor while still making profits. The design emerged in the 1590s, developed by shipwrights in Dutch coastal towns who were trying to solve a practical problem. Dutch merchants needed to transport bulk goods, grain, timber, salt, wine in large quantities at low cost. These weren't valuable cargoes that could bear high transportation costs. Grain from the Baltic, timber from Scandinavia, these were heavy, bulky goods with thin profit margins. The transportation cost often exceeded the value of the goods themselves. To make money on such cargoes, you needed very low freight rates. The fleet's design solved this through a series of clever compromises. The hull was designed to maximise cargo space while minimising the measurements used to calculate port fees. Many ports charged fees based on deck area or keel length. The fleet had a narrow deck and stern but a wide rounded hull below the waterline. It carried enormous cargo in relation to its official measurements, effectively reducing the fee per ton of cargo. The ship's construction used standardised components and efficient assembly methods. Dutch shipyards produced fleets in volume, using prefabricated parts and systematic construction processes. A Floyd could be built in weeks rather than months. This speed and efficiency reduced construction costs substantially. Labour costs were lower per ship because workers weren't doing custom work. They were repeating familiar processes. The Floyd's rigging was designed for simplicity. The masts and sails were arranged so that a small crew could handle them. This was the key to low operating costs. Sailors were expensive. They had to be fed, paid wages, and cared for when ill. A typical merchant ship from England or France might need 30 or 40 sailors to operate. A Floyd of comparable size could be managed by 10 or 12. This dramatic reduction in crew size meant that daily operating costs, food, wages, replacement for losses, were a third or a quarter of what competitors paid. The reduced crew was possible because the Floyd wasn't designed to fight. It carried few or no guns. In dangerous waters, fleets travelled in convoys protected by armed escort ships. This division of labour, unarmed cargo ships protected by dedicated warships, was more efficient than having every merchant ship armed. Guns were heavy and expensive. Gun crews required skilled sailors. By omitting armament, the Floyd could carry more cargo and need fewer crew. The result of all these design choices was a ship that could transport bulk goods at freight rates competitors couldn't match. If an English merchant wanted to ship Baltic grain to Portugal, a Dutch Floyd could offer rates 30 or 40% lower than an English ship. Even accounting for profits, the Dutch rate was still cheaper because their cost was so much lower. Over time, this cost advantage gave Dutch shippers an overwhelming competitive position in Europe's bulk trades. Consider the Baltic trade because it was central to Dutch prosperity. The Baltic region, modern Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, produced vast quantities of grain. Polish estates grew wheat and rye in abundance. But Poland had limited population and cities. The grain needed to be exported. Western Europe, particularly the Mediterranean, needed grain imports. The Baltic grain trade was enormous, feeding millions of people. The Dutch dominated this trade. Every year, thousands of Dutch ships passed through the Danish Sound, the narrow strait between Denmark and Sweden that connected the Baltic to the North Sea. The Danish king charged tolls on ships passing through. Records of these sound tolls show Dutch dominance clearly. In the early 1600s, Dutch ships accounted for 60 to 70% of all traffic through the Sound. No other nation came close. The ships sailed to Danzig, modern Gdansk, the great port where Polish grain was exported. They loaded wheat and rye by the thousands of tons. They also loaded timber, tall pines needed for ships' masts, oak for hulls, deals and planks for construction. From other Baltic ports they took hemp for rope, pitch and tar for waterproofing ships, flax for linen. These were naval stores, essential supplies that every maritime nation needed. The return voyage brought different cargoes. The Baltic needed salt for preserving fish and meat. The Dutch controlled salt pans in western France and Portugal, and they carried that salt eastward. They brought herring from the North Sea fishery. They brought wines from France and Spain. They brought spices and colonial goods that had arrived in Amsterdam from the Indies. Every ship that went east loaded and every ship that returned loaded. The profits came from both directions. The volume of this trade was staggering. In a single year in the early 1600s, over 3,000 Dutch ships might pass through the Sound. Each ship made multiple voyages per year. The total tonnage of goods transported was measured in hundreds of thousands of tons annually. This was bulk trade on an industrial scale, and it required Amsterdam's merchants to organise complex logistics, manage vast quantities of goods, and coordinate thousands of ships and sailors. Amsterdam served as the central hub. Ships arrived with Baltic grain, which was stored in warehouses on the eastern islands. Some grain was consumed in the Netherlands. The Dutch didn't grow enough to feed themselves, but much was re-exported to southern Europe. Ships that had brought grain from the Baltic would be reloaded with wine or salt or textiles, and sent south to Portugal or the Mediterranean. The warehouse workers in Amsterdam sorted, stored, and redistributed goods from across the known world. This entrepot function, importing for the purpose of re-exporting, was central to Amsterdam's commercial model. The city became a staple market where buyers knew they could find whatever they needed. A merchant in Venice needing Baltic timber didn't travel to Danzig. He went to Amsterdam, where merchants had timber in stock and could arrange delivery. A merchant in Poland wanting Portuguese wine bought it from Amsterdam traders, who kept it warehoused and available. The information that flowed through Amsterdam was as valuable as the goods. Merchants shared news about harvests, about wars that might disrupt trade, about demand in different markets. If you heard that a Mediterranean grain harvest had failed, you knew grain prices there would rise, and you could buy grain in Amsterdam and ship it south for profit. If you learned that Swedish iron production was increasing, you could anticipate lower iron prices and adjust your trading accordingly. This information network, combined with the Whistlebank's efficient payment systems and the VOC's investment opportunities, made Amsterdam the place where commerce happened. Not just physically, goods flowing through warehouses, but informationally and financially. Amsterdam was where you went to learn what was happening in global markets, where you went to raise capital or settle accounts, where you went to buy or sell almost anything. The ships that made this possible were humble workhorses. A float wasn't beautiful. It sat low in the water when loaded, wallowing through waves rather than cutting through them. It was slow. A voyage from Amsterdam to Danzig might take 2 weeks with favourable winds, longer if winds were contrary. The sailors who worked floats weren't glamorous adventurers like VOC crews sailing to the Indies. They were working men doing hard, dangerous labour for modest wages. Life aboard a float was harsh. The crew was minimal, so everyone worked constantly. Sails had to be adjusted as wind shifted. Cargo had to be loaded and unloaded, often by the crew themselves in ports where stevedores weren't available. The ships leaked. All wooden ships leaked. And someone had to pump constantly to keep the bilges clear. Food was monotonous. Salt pork or beef, ship's biscuit, dried peas, cheese. Fresh food ran out within days of leaving port. Water stored in barrels grew stale and developed algae. Winter sailing was particularly brutal. The North Sea and Baltic in winter were cold, stormy and dangerous. Ice formed on rigging, making it heavy and treacherous. Waves could wash crew overboard. Ships could be driven onto rocks or shoals. But the trade continued through winter because grain and timber were needed year-round, and Dutch merchants couldn't afford to leave ships idle for months. Deaths at sea were common. Disease, dysentery, typhus, scurvy on longer voyages killed regularly. Accidents killed too. A sailor could fall from rigging, be crushed by cargo shifting in rough seas, or simply disappear overboard in a moment when no one was watching. The death rate among sailors was high enough that recruitment was a constant challenge. Many sailors were foreigners, Germans, Scandinavians, even English, attracted by wages and the availability of work. Women rarely sailed on merchant ships, though captains' wives sometimes accompanied their husbands. In port, women worked in related industries, making sails, processing fish, running boarding houses and taverns that served sailors. The maritime economy employed entire communities directly and indirectly. The profits from the carrying trade were modest per voyage, but reliable and cumulative. A float carrying grain from Danzig to Amsterdam might earn the owner a profit of 5 or 10% on the voyage. That doesn't sound spectacular compared to the 400% returns of successful VOC spice voyages, but the float made multiple voyages per year, with minimal risk of total loss. Over a decade, a single float could return several times its original cost, and a merchant who owned multiple ships, making dozens of voyages annually, accumulated steady wealth. Amsterdam's merchant fleet numbered in the thousands by the mid-1600s. The city's shipyards built constantly to replace ships lost to storms and age. The rope walks, sail lofts, and anchor smithies employed thousands of workers. The coopers making barrels, the chandlers supplying ships, the bakers producing ship's biscuit. All these trades thrived on maritime commerce. The economic impact extended into the countryside. Farms in North Holland grew crops to provision ships. Breweries produced beer for ships' stores. Cheesemakers supplied the hard cheeses that could last through long voyages. The maritime economy wasn't just urban, it structured rural production and employment across the region. This vast maritime commercial system, built on unglamorous bulk trades, generated the wealth that flowed through Amsterdam. It created demand for the Wisselbank services. All those cargo sales needed to be settled. It created capital that could be invested in VOC shares or lent to other ventures. It employed the population, fed the city, and paid the taxes that funded civic improvements. The herring and the float aren't as dramatic as the spice trade, but they were more fundamental. The VOC was spectacular and important, but it was a relatively small part of Amsterdam's economy. The bulk trades, the carrying of grain and timber and salt, the fishing and preserving of herring, these ordinary activities done efficiently and at scale were the real foundation of Dutch commercial dominance. There's a lesson in that about the nature of wealth and power. Sometimes it comes not from doing something exotic, but from doing something ordinary better than anyone else, from finding efficiencies that seem small but compound over time, from building systems that work reliably and cheaply. The Dutch didn't have colonial empires like Spain and Portugal. They didn't have gold and silver mines. What they had was ships that could carry goods cheaply, and a city that could handle those goods efficiently. That was enough to make them the commercial centre of Europe and, for a time, the richest people in the world. The wealth flowing into Amsterdam from herring and timber, from spices and carrying trades, needed somewhere to go, somewhere to be invested, traded, multiplied. That somewhere was the Beurs, the Amsterdam Exchange, a covered courtyard in the heart of the city where merchants gathered daily to conduct business. And it was there, in that busy, noisy space, that modern financial markets were born. The exchange building itself was completed in 1611, designed by Hendrik de Keyser, in a style that balanced commercial function with civic pride. It stood on the Rokin, one of Amsterdam's central canals, easily accessible from anywhere in the city. The building formed a rectangle around an open courtyard. Covered arcades ran along all four sides, their roof supported by columns. The arcades provided shelter from rain, while the open courtyard allowed light and air. In good weather, merchants spilled into the courtyard itself. In rain or cold, they conducted business under the arcades. The exchange was open for 2 hours each day, from noon to 2 in the afternoon. These were the official trading hours, though informal trading happened at other times in coffee houses and taverns nearby. But during those 2 hours, the exchange was the centre of Amsterdam's commercial world. Hundreds of merchants gathered dressed in dark, sober clothing. The Dutch weren't ostentatious, conducting the business that made Amsterdam wealthy. What happened at the exchange? Everything, really. Merchants traded commodities, grain, spices, timber, textiles, anything that could be bought and sold in quantity. They exchanged bills of exchange, the paper instruments that allowed someone in Amsterdam to pay someone in Hamburg or Venice, without physically transporting coins. They bought and sold marine insurance, contracts that transferred the risk of ships being lost at sea, and increasingly, they traded in shares of the VOC and other joint stock companies. The atmosphere was intense but ordered. Merchants clustered in groups by commodity or region. Those trading Baltic grain gathered in one area, spice traders in another, share traders in yet another. This spatial organisation happened organically. No one assigned spaces, but patterns emerged and persisted. If you wanted to buy shares, you went to the area where share traders congregated. If you needed to insure a ship, you found the underwriters who gathered near a particular column. Information flowed through the exchange constantly. Ships had arrived. What cargo did they carry? A harvest had failed in Poland. grain prices would rise. War had broken out somewhere. Certain trade routes would be dangerous. Merchants shared news, sometimes truthfully, sometimes strategically. Knowing something before others knew it could mean profit. Spreading rumours could move prices in directions that benefited you. Joseph de la Vega, a merchant of Portuguese Jewish heritage who wrote about the exchange in the late 1600s, left us the most vivid description of this world. His book, Quote 2, written in 1688, was the first book ever published about stock trading. It's written as a dialogue between a philosopher, a merchant, and a shareholder discussing how the market works and the psychology of trading. De la Vega described the traders in almost affectionate terms, despite recognizing their flaws. There were the bulls, who believed share prices would rise and bought accordingly. There were the bears, who believed prices would fall and sold shares they didn't own, hoping to buy them back cheaper later. There were the speculators who traded constantly, trying to profit from small price movements. And there were the long-term investors who bought shares and held them for the dividends, rarely trading. The mechanics of share trading were becoming sophisticated. You could buy shares outright, paying the full price and receiving ownership. This was straightforward investment, but you could also buy on margin, paying only a portion of the price up front and borrowing the rest. This leverage amplified both gains and losses. If the share price rose, your profit was magnified because you'd controlled more shares than you could have bought with cash alone. If the price fell, your losses were similarly magnified, and you might owe more than you'd invested. Short selling was already practiced, though it was controversial. To sell short, you'd sell shares you didn't own, promising to deliver them at a future date. You hoped the price would fall in the meantime, allowing you to buy the shares cheaply and deliver them at the higher price you'd already received. If the price rose instead, you'd lose money, potentially substantial amounts if the price rose sharply. Short selling struck some as immoral. Selling something you didn't have seemed dishonest, but others saw it as a legitimate way to profit from overvalued shares. Options trading emerged as well. A call option gave you the right, but not the obligation, to buy shares at a specified price before a certain date. A put option gave you the right to sell at a specified price. These options cost money, a premium you paid to the person selling you the option, but they allowed sophisticated strategies. You could protect your holdings from price declines by buying put options. You could speculate on price increases with call options, risking only the premium rather than the full share price. These financial instruments, margin, short selling, options, all emerged organically from the basic fact that VOC shares could be freely traded. Merchants, being clever and motivated by profit, figured out ways to trade not just shares but positions in shares, bets on future prices, hedges against unwanted risks. No regulatory body designed these instruments. They evolved through practice, through merchants trying things and keeping what worked. The terminology of trading developed too. Traders used hand signals and jargon that outsiders couldn't follow. A deal might be struck with a nod and a few words, binding by reputation even though no written contract existed. Disputes were rare because everyone knew everyone else, at least within the trading community, and reputation was too valuable to risk for short-term gain. De la Vega described the psychology of trading with remarkable insight. He wrote about how traders became obsessed with price movements, how they convinced themselves that prices would move in whatever direction benefited their positions, how they ignored information that contradicted their hopes. He described the anxiety of holding a position overnight, wondering what news might arrive before the exchange opened tomorrow. He wrote about the euphoria of successful trades and the despair of losses. The share price of the VOC fluctuated based on news from the Indies, on political developments, on rumour and speculation. A report that a fleet had been lost to storms would send the price down. Confirmed news of a rich cargo arriving would send it up. But prices also moved based on speculation about future dividends, on traders' collective mood, on technical factors like how many shares were available for sale at any given moment. Some traders tried to manipulate prices. A group of wealthy merchants might spread false rumours to drive the price down, then buy shares cheaply before the rumours were revealed as false. Or they might create artificial demand by buying heavily, attracting other buyers who thought the price was rising for fundamental reasons, then selling into that demand at inflated prices. These manipulations were considered sharp practice but weren't illegal. There were few regulations governing trading. The Amsterdam authorities worried about speculation destabilising the market or the broader economy. In 1610, just 8 years after the VOC's founding, they banned short selling, concerned that bears were driving down share prices unfairly. The ban was ineffective. Short selling continued, just less openly. The authorities eventually gave up on banning it and instead tried to regulate it, requiring contracts to be registered and enforced. The exchange also facilitated commodity trading, and here the patterns that would lead to modern futures markets emerged. A merchant might agree to buy a shipload of Baltic grain to be delivered in 3 months at a specified price. This was a forward contract, and it served legitimate purposes. The grain merchant locked in a price, protecting against the risk that grain prices might rise before his ship arrived. The buyer locked in supply and price, protecting against the risk of scarcity. But forward contracts could also be speculative. You could contract to buy grain you never intended to actually receive, hoping to sell the contract at a profit if grain prices rose. The grain itself became almost abstract. What you were really trading was price exposure, risk, the bet on what would happen in future markets. This abstraction, this separation of financial trading from physical commodity trading, would become increasingly important over time. The coffee houses near the exchange were extensions of the trading floor. After the exchange closed at 2 in the afternoon, merchants would repair to their favourite coffee houses to continue discussions, seal deals, share information. The coffeehouse culture was essential to how Amsterdam's markets worked. Over coffee and tobacco, the Dutch loved their pipes, merchants built the relationships that made commerce possible. Women participated in trading, though less visibly than men. Widows often managed the trading accounts and shareholdings their husbands had left. Some women traded actively. The Dutch were practical about such things. If a woman could trade profitably, social conventions against women in commerce were overlooked, but the exchange itself was male-dominated, and women's participation was mostly behind the scenes. The international character of Amsterdam's markets was striking. Merchants from across Europe traded at the exchange. Portuguese Jews who'd fled the Inquisition were prominent in certain trades, particularly those involving connections to the Iberian colonies. German merchants, English factors, Scandinavian traders, all mingled in the exchange courtyard. Religious and national differences mattered less than commercial reliability. If you honoured your contracts and paid your debts, you were welcome. This cosmopolitan tolerance had practical advantages. The Portuguese Jewish community brought expertise in trading colonial goods and connections to markets in the Americas and Asia. Huguenot refugees from France brought skills in textiles and luxury goods. Each wave of refugees fleeing persecution elsewhere brought human capital that enriched Amsterdam's commercial capabilities. The exchange facilitated insurance markets that were crucial for maritime commerce. A merchant planning to send a ship to the Indies faced enormous risk. The ship might be lost to storms, pirates, or war. Insurance transferred that risk. The merchant would pay a premium, perhaps 10 or 15% of the ship's value, to underwriters who agreed to pay if the ship was lost. This allowed merchants to undertake voyages they couldn't have risked otherwise. The underwriters were often syndicates of wealthy merchants spreading risk among themselves. If a ship worth 50,000 guilders was being insured, 10 merchants might each take a 5,000 guilder share of the risk, receiving proportional premiums. This syndication distributed risk so that no single underwriter was ruined if a ship was lost. It was an early form of reinsurance, of risk management through diversification. The premiums charged reflected the perceived risk. A voyage to the Baltic in summer might be insured for 5% of the ship's value. A voyage to the Indies might require 15 or 20%. A voyage through waters where pirates operated might be uninsurable at any price, or insurable only at premiums so high that the voyage became unprofitable. The insurance market, through premiums, provided information about risk that helped merchants make decisions. Disputes about insurance claims were inevitable. A ship claimed as lost to storms might have been lost to negligence or incompetence. An underwriter might suspect fraud. Had the ship really been lost, or had it been deliberately scuttled? Amsterdam developed institutions for adjudicating these disputes, legal processes and arbitration systems that balanced speed with fairness. The reliability of these systems encouraged insurance, which encouraged risky but potentially profitable ventures. The bills of exchange market at the exchange was equally sophisticated. A bill of exchange was essentially a promissory note drawn on a foreign account. A merchant in Amsterdam who owed money to a merchant in Venice could buy a bill of exchange from a banker with connections in Venice. The banker would issue a document instructing his correspondent in Venice to pay the specified amount to the Venetian merchant. The Amsterdam merchant paid the banker in Amsterdam, and the Venetian merchant collected in Venice. No money physically travelled between the cities. Bills of exchange served multiple purposes. They facilitated international trade without requiring physical transport of coins, which was risky and expensive. They provided credit. The bill might not be payable for 3 months, giving the debtor time to complete his own sales before paying, and they created arbitrage opportunities in foreign exchange rates. The rate at which Amsterdam guilders exchanged for Venetian ducats might differ between Amsterdam and Venice. Clever merchants could profit from these differences. The rates at which bills of exchange traded reflected supply and demand for different currencies in different locations. If many Amsterdam merchants needed to make payments in Venice, demand for bills on Venice would rise, and the rate would move against the guilder. If few payments were needed, the rate would move in Amsterdam's favour. These rate movements transmitted information about trade flows and capital movements across Europe. The sophistication of these markets, shares, commodities, insurance, foreign exchange, all happening in the same physical space, all interconnected, represented something unprecedented. Earlier financial centres had specialised. Venice was strong in certain trades, Antwerp in others. But Amsterdam combined everything in one market with shared infrastructure, the whistle bank for payments, the exchange for trading, the legal system for enforcement. De la Vega, reflecting on the exchange, wrote with a mixture of wonder and wariness. He marvelled at the ingenuity of the financial instruments, at the complexity of the strategies traders employed, at the sheer volume of business conducted. But he also warned about the dangers of speculation, about how the desire for profit could lead to ruin, about how markets could become detached from underlying realities. He told stories of traders who'd made fortunes and lost them, of clever schemes that succeeded and foolish ones that failed. He described the tension between trading as a serious business, allocating capital to productive uses, and trading as a form of gambling, simply betting on price movements. This tension between markets as efficient resource allocators and markets as casinos would persist throughout financial history. The exchange, for all its innovations and sophistication, remained recognizably human in scale. It was a physical place where people gathered face to face. Trust and reputation mattered because you'd likely see the person you were trading with again tomorrow. Information spread through conversation as much as through formal channels. The markets worked through personal relationships as much as through impersonal mechanisms. This human scale would eventually change. As markets grew, as trading became more abstract, as communications technology allowed trading without physical presence, the personal element would diminish. But in 17th century Amsterdam, the market was still a place, the exchange a building, the traders people who knew each other's faces and reputations. This gave the market certain characteristics: informal enforcement mechanisms, relationship-based trust, social pressures against dishonesty that would be harder to maintain as markets grew larger and more impersonal. By the 1630s and 40s, the Amsterdam Exchange was the most sophisticated financial market in the world. The instruments traded there, the practices that had developed, the institutional infrastructure supporting it, all of this represented genuine innovation. Other cities would study Amsterdam's example and try to replicate its success. But replication proved difficult because the exchange wasn't just a building or a set of rules. It was a culture, a network of relationships, an accumulation of trust and practice that had developed organically over decades. You could copy the formal structures, but capturing the essence was harder. The exchange made Amsterdam not just a place where goods were traded, but where capital was allocated, where risk was priced, where information was processed into prices that guided economic decisions across Europe and beyond. It was, in a very real sense, the central nervous system of early modern capitalism, processing signals about supply and demand, risk and opportunity, scarcity and abundance, and transmitting those signals through prices that everyone could observe and respond to. And it did this not through central planning or divine wisdom, but through thousands of individual merchants making countless decisions in pursuit of profit, generating from their collective activity an emergent order that no one fully understood, but that somehow worked. The markets developing at the exchange traded in many things, but in the winter of 1636 to 1637, one particular commodity captured the imagination and speculation of Amsterdam's traders in a way that has echoed through history. That commodity was tulip bulbs, and the episode that unfolded became known as Tulipmania, a story that's been told and retold, embellished and mythologized, until it's difficult to separate what actually happened from what people believe happened. Let's approach this carefully, because Tulipmania matters not so much for what it was, which was more limited than legend suggests, but for what it reveals about markets, human nature, and the stories we tell ourselves about speculation and folly. Tulips weren't native to the Netherlands. They came from the Ottoman Empire, brought to Europe in the mid-1500s. The first tulips arrived in the Netherlands around 1593, brought by Carolus Clusius, a botanist at the University of Leiden. Clusius cultivated tulips in the university's botanical garden, studying their varieties and propagation. He didn't intend to create a commercial market. He was interested in tulips as botanical specimens, but his work introduced the flower to Dutch horticulture. What made tulips fascinating, particularly to wealthy collectors, was their variety. Tulip bulbs produced flowers in a spectacular range of colours and patterns. Some were solid colours, red, yellow, white, but the most prized were the, quote, 3 tulips, flowers with dramatic striped or feathered patterns. Petals that showed 2 or 3 colours in intricate designs, a white tulip with red flames, a yellow tulip with purple stripes. These broken tulips were rare and beautiful. What created these patterns, though no one knew it at the time, was a virus. The mosaic virus affected tulip bulbs, causing the colour breaking that produced those dramatic patterns. The virus weakened the bulbs, making them less likely to propagate successfully, which made the rare patterns even rarer. Tulip enthusiasts, not understanding the viral cause, could only observe that certain spectacular varieties were difficult to reproduce and therefore extremely valuable. By the 1620s, tulips had become fashionable among the Dutch wealthy and among collectors across Europe. Growing tulips demonstrated taste, sophistication, and wealth. A garden filled with rare varieties was a status symbol. The most spectacular tulips acquired names that suggested their value: Admiral Liefken, General Bol, Viceroy. The military titles associated the flowers with power and command. The most famous tulip of all was Semper Augustus, a white flower with red flames. Semper Augustus was extraordinarily rare, only a handful of bulbs existed, all descended from a single mutation. Contemporary paintings show its striking appearance. Bold red stripes on a white background, a perfectly symmetrical flower. In the early 1630s, a single Semper Augustus bulb was worth several thousand guilders, as much as a nice house in Amsterdam. The value of rare tulip bulbs created a market. Growers cultivated tulips, hoping to produce rare varieties. Collectors bought and sold bulbs, trading for varieties they wanted. Wealthy merchants maintained tulip gardens where they displayed their collections. The tulip became embedded in Dutch culture, appearing in paintings, in decorative arts, in the self-image of the Dutch Golden Age. But tulips had a peculiar characteristic that would shape the speculation to come. Tulip bulbs can only be transplanted safely during certain months, roughly June through September when the bulbs are dormant. During the growing season, from autumn planting through spring flowering, bulbs are in the ground and can't be moved without damage. This created a problem for trading. How could you sell a bulb that was currently in the ground and couldn't be delivered for months? The solution was forward contracts. You'd agree to sell a bulb that was currently growing, with delivery to occur after the bulb went dormant. The buyer would pay at delivery, or perhaps a portion up front and the remainder at delivery. These forward contracts allowed year-round trading in tulips, even though physical bulbs could only change hands during certain months. In the winter of 1636 to 1637, something unusual happened. The market for tulip bulbs, which had previously been limited to wealthy collectors and serious growers, suddenly expanded to include people who had no interest in actually growing tulips. They were trading purely for profit, buying contracts for bulbs they never intended to receive, planning to sell the contracts at higher prices before delivery came due. This trading happened largely in taverns rather than at the exchange. Groups of traders would gather at a tavern, often on specific days of the week, and trade tulip contracts. They called it collegia, though it wasn't formal or official. Someone would offer a bulb contract for sale. Others would bid. When a price was agreed, wine was drunk to seal the deal, and a small fee, wine money, was paid to the seller. Then the contract might be resold immediately to another trader at a higher price. The traders participating in these tavern markets were often not wealthy merchants but artisans, craftsmen, people with some capital but not the fortunes of Amsterdam's elite. Weavers were particularly prominent in tulip trading. The textile industry was centred in cities like Haarlem, which became a centre of tulip trading. These weren't people who could afford to buy Semper Augustus bulbs costing thousands of guilders. They were trading in more common varieties that cost tens or hundreds of guilders. But even these more common bulbs saw dramatic price increases in late 1636 and early 1637. A bulb that might have cost 20 guilders in November could cost 200 guilders in January. The price increases fed on themselves. People saw others making profits, heard stories of successful trades and wanted to participate. They bought contracts hoping to sell them at higher prices. As long as prices kept rising, this worked. The term used for this trading was wind handle, wind trade, trading in wind. It captured the insubstantial nature of the speculation. People weren't buying tulips to grow them. They were buying contracts they'd never fulfill, selling them to others who'd also never fulfill them, trading in nothing more substantial than promises and prices. Contemporary observers describe the scene in the taverns with a mixture of fascination and disapproval. Fortunes seemed to be made overnight. A weaver might trade a few bulb contracts and make enough money to buy a house. Stories circulated, probably exaggerated, possibly invented, of spectacular gains. Someone had traded a single rare bulb for a grand house on an Amsterdam canal, or for a fully loaded merchant ship, or for an enormous quantity of goods and cash. One famous story lists the items supposedly traded for a single viceroy bulb: 12 acres of land, 4 fat oxen, 8 fat pigs, 12 fat sheep, 2 hogsheads of wine, 4 tons of beer, 2 tons of butter, 1,000 pounds of cheese, a silver drinking cup, a set of fine clothes, a bed complete with linens, and a ship. This inventory is almost certainly fictional or wildly exaggerated, but it circulated and was believed, feeding the sense that tulip speculation could produce impossible wealth. The peak of the mania came in early February 1637. Prices for some bulb contracts had increased 10-fold or 20-fold in a matter of weeks. Then, suddenly the market collapsed. At an auction in Haarlem on February 5th, buyers didn't appear. Sellers tried to find buyers but encountered resistance. Within days, prices were falling precipitously. Within weeks, prices had collapsed to a fraction of their peak. What caused the collapse? No single event triggered it. More likely, the market simply reached a point where buyers became scarce. The people buying bulb contracts in late January had been assuming they could sell at higher prices in February. But eventually there were no more buyers willing to pay higher prices. Once prices stopped rising, the whole structure of speculation collapsed. Why buy a contract for 200 guilders if you can't sell it for 250? Why buy at all if prices are falling? The collapse created chaos, particularly for those who'd bought at peak prices. They held contracts to buy bulbs at prices far above current market value. They owed money they might not have. Sellers held contracts to deliver bulbs at prices that were now far below what they could have gotten weeks earlier. Both sides faced losses. Many of those involved wanted to void their contracts, to simply walk away as if the trades had never happened. And here's where the story takes an interesting turn. The courts largely allowed this. Judges ruled that the tavern trades, conducted outside official markets without proper formalities, weren't legally enforceable. The contracts were void, or could be settled for small percentages of the nominal amounts. People who'd agreed to buy bulbs for hundreds of guilders could settle for a few guilders or nothing at all. This resolution meant the economic impact of Tulipmania's collapse was limited. Yes, some people lost money, those who'd invested heavily and couldn't recover their funds. But there weren't mass bankruptcies, no financial crisis spreading through the economy. The damage was mostly confined to those directly involved in the tulip trade, and even there it was less catastrophic than the price collapse might suggest. In the centuries since, Tulipmania has been told as a cautionary tale about speculation, about markets gone mad, about the folly of believing prices can rise forever. These retellings often exaggerate what happened. They claim the entire Dutch economy was caught up in tulip fever, that everyone from servants to nobles was speculating, that the collapse caused economic devastation. These claims are overstatements. Tulipmania involved relatively few people, mostly in a few cities, trading in relatively modest amounts. The broader Amsterdam financial markets, the VOC shares, the commodity trade, the carrying trade, continued largely unaffected. But Tulipmania does reveal something true about markets and speculation. It shows how prices can become detached from underlying value, how the expectation that prices will rise can itself drive prices up, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy that lasts until it doesn't. It shows how new participants enter markets during booms, people without expertise who are drawn by profit opportunities they've heard about. It shows how speculation can spread through social networks, weavers talking to other weavers in taverns, each encouraging the others that tulip trading was profitable. The comparison to other market bubbles is obvious and has been made countless times. Tulipmania is invoked whenever markets seem irrationally exuberant, whenever people seem to be buying assets just because prices are rising. Sometimes the comparison is apt. Markets do sometimes exhibit tulip-like behaviour, prices rising not because of changing fundamentals but because of speculation feeding on itself. Sometimes the comparison is lazy, a way of dismissing any price increase as irrational without examining whether there might be genuine reasons for changing values. What's interesting about Tulipmania from Amsterdam's perspective is how little it mattered to the city's financial development. The collapse didn't discredit financial markets generally. The VOC shares continued to trade. The exchange continued to function. Amsterdam's position as financial capital wasn't undermined. This suggests that contemporaries understood Tulipmania as an isolated episode of speculation in a peculiar market, not as evidence that markets themselves were flawed. There's also something to consider about what Tulipmania wasn't. It wasn't fraud exactly. People were buying real contracts for real bulbs, even if they never intended to take delivery. It wasn't market manipulation in the usual sense. No organised group was artificially driving prices. It was something more organic, a collective delusion perhaps, or a speculative fever, but one that emerged from individual decisions rather than from coordinated scheming. The aesthetics of tulips mattered too. These weren't abstract financial instruments. They were beautiful flowers that people genuinely valued for their beauty. The speculation built on top of genuine appreciation. The Semper Augustus really was spectacular. People really did want rare tulips for their gardens. The speculation pushed prices to absurd levels, but it started from something real, the human love of beauty and rarity. Joseph de la Vega, writing about Amsterdam's markets decades later, mentioned Tulipmania briefly, almost dismissively. He saw it as an aberration, not particularly interesting compared to the ongoing sophisticated trading in VOC shares and other securities. His focus was on the regular markets, the daily trading in the exchange, the bulls and bears and their strategies. Tulipmania was a curiosity, a historical footnote, not the main story of Amsterdam's financial innovation. Modern historians who've studied the actual records, the contracts, the auction records, the account books, have concluded that Tulipmania was smaller and less economically significant than popular history suggests. The number of people involved was perhaps a few hundred to a few thousand, not the entire Dutch population. The amounts traded were substantial for individuals but small compared to the VOC or the Baltic trade. The economic damage from the collapse was modest, yet the story persists and resonates because it captures something about human behaviour in markets. The desire to get rich quickly, the tendency to believe that this time is different, that prices will keep rising. The social proof, if everyone else is buying, it must be wise. The fear of missing out on profits others are making. These psychological patterns appear repeatedly in financial history, and Tulipmania, whether or not its details are accurate, captures them in a memorable story. There's also a moralizing element to how Tulipmania has been told. It's often presented as punishment for greed, for abandoning productive labour to chase speculative gains. The weavers who left their looms to trade tulips in taverns were violating proper economic behaviour, and their losses were deserved. This moralising isn't entirely fair. Speculation isn't inherently immoral, and markets need speculators to provide liquidity and price discovery. But the moralising reveals anxiety about speculation, about markets, about the way capitalism can seem divorced from production and labour. Amsterdam, after Tulipmania, continued to develop its financial markets, continued to innovate in corporate structure and securities trading, continued to serve as Europe's commercial and financial centre. The tulip episode didn't derail that development. If anything, it provided a lesson about the limits of speculation, about the importance of distinguishing between investment and gambling, about the need for markets to be grounded in something more than momentum and hope. Tulips themselves remained valuable. The Dutch continued to cultivate and trade them, though at more reasonable prices. The tulip became an enduring symbol of Dutch culture, appearing in art and design, exported as cut flowers and bulbs to this day. The flower's association with the Netherlands survived Tulipmania, and in some ways was reinforced by it. The story of Dutch tulips, including the mania, became part of Dutch identity. For our story of Amsterdam's rise as financial capital, Tulipmania is a minor episode, an interesting digression, but not central to the main narrative. What mattered more was the ongoing development of the exchange, the growing sophistication of financial instruments, the expansion of trade networks, the stability provided by institutions like the Wisselbank. These were the foundations of Amsterdam's dominance, and they continued to strengthen even as tulip prices rose and fell. But Tulipmania remains worth understanding because it reveals the human element in markets, the psychology that drives speculation, the social dynamics that create bubbles. Markets aren't purely rational mechanisms. They're collections of people, and people are subject to emotion, to social influence, to hope and fear and greed. The most sophisticated financial instruments, the most elegant market structures, still operate through human decisions and are subject to human psychology. As winter turned to spring in 1637, as tulip bulbs that had been traded frantically in taverns bloomed in gardens across the Netherlands, their flowers were beautiful, regardless of what prices their bulbs had fetched in the madness of February. The beauty was real, even if the prices had been illusion. And Amsterdam's merchants, having learned whatever lessons they drew from the episode, returned their attention to the serious business of global trade, to the ships arriving from the Indies, to the grain flowing from the Baltic, to the shares trading at the exchange, to the building of wealth through commerce and finance that would continue through Amsterdam's golden age. The wealth accumulating in Amsterdam from trade and finance didn't just sit in vaults or exist as numbers in the Wisselbank's ledgers. It transformed into something visible and lasting. Art, ideas, scientific instruments, beautiful buildings. A cultural flowering that made Amsterdam not just a centre of commerce, but a centre of intellectual and artistic achievement. The relationship between money and culture in Amsterdam's golden age was intimate and unashamed. Commerce funded art, and art celebrated commerce. Walk along the Herengracht, the Gentleman's Canal in the mid-1600s. The houses that line this canal are substantial, 3 or 4 stories tall, built of brick with elegant gables. They're not palaces, the Dutch didn't build palaces, but they're clearly the homes of wealthy people. Inside, these houses blend the domestic and the commercial. The ground floor might have a counting house where the merchant conducts business, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence. The upper floors are living spaces, furnished with care and displaying the owner's wealth and taste. The walls of these houses were covered with paintings, not just a few carefully chosen pieces, but dozens, sometimes hundreds of paintings. An inventory of a wealthy merchant's house might list 40 or 50 paintings in the main rooms alone. Paintings hung in stacks covering walls from floor to ceiling. This wasn't unusual. Dutch households of any means owned paintings. It was a mark of respectability, of culture, of participation in the prosperity that Amsterdam enjoyed. The paintings themselves depicted a distinctive range of subjects. Religious paintings, which had dominated European art for centuries, were less common in Protestant Netherlands. The Dutch preferred secular subjects, landscapes showing the Dutch countryside, seascapes with ships and harbours, still lifes of flowers or food. Genre scenes showing everyday life, and portraits of individuals and families. Consider the genre scenes, because they show us how merchants and artisans lived. Jan Steen painted raucous tavern scenes and chaotic households. Peter de Hooch painted quiet domestic interiors with women engaged in household tasks. Johannes Vermeer, working in Delft rather than Amsterdam but selling to Amsterdam collectors, painted scenes of extraordinary stillness and light. A woman reading a letter by a window. A maid pouring milk. A woman wearing pearls. Vermeer's paintings, which are now among the most valued in the world, depict the merchant class at home. The woman, holding a balance, shows a woman in an elegant interior, wealthy but not ostentatious, engaged in the practical activity of weighing gold or pearls. Light streams through a window. In the background hangs a painting of the Last Judgment, a subtle commentary perhaps on weighing earthly wealth against spiritual judgment. The painting captures the Dutch merchant world, prosperous, domestic, contemplative, aware of both material and spiritual dimensions. These paintings were commodities as well as art. Amsterdam had an active art market. Paintings were bought and sold at markets, through dealers, directly from artists. Prices varied enormously. A landscape by a minor artist might cost a few guilders. A portrait by Rembrandt van Rijn, Amsterdam's most famous artist, could cost hundreds of guilders. The market set prices based on reputation, skill, subject matter, and size. Rembrandt himself embodied the complicated relationship between art and commerce in Amsterdam. He arrived in Amsterdam in 1631, already gaining recognition as a talented young painter. He established himself quickly, receiving commissions for portraits from wealthy merchants and civic leaders. His group portrait, The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Nicolaes Tulp, painted in 1632, made his reputation. It showed Dr. Tulp, a prominent surgeon, demonstrating an autopsy to members of the Surgeons' Guild. The painting was both art and advertisement. It celebrated the guild and the individuals, displaying their learning and professional standing. Rembrandt prospered in Amsterdam's art market. He bought a grand house on the Sint-Antonisbrugstraat, now called the Rembrandthuis, in 1639. The house cost 13,000 guilders, a substantial sum financed partly by mortgage. Rembrandt filled the house with an extraordinary collection: art by other masters, curiosities from distant lands, props and costumes for his paintings, natural specimens. He lived like a wealthy merchant, surrounded by beautiful and exotic objects. But Rembrandt also spent like a wealthy merchant, and his income from painting, while substantial, wasn't always sufficient to cover his expenses. He bought compulsively at auctions, acquiring more art and objects than he needed. His workshop produced many paintings, employing assistants who worked in his style, but even this production couldn't keep up with his spending. In 1656, Rembrandt was declared insolvent. His house and collection were sold to pay creditors. The inventory of Rembrandt's collection, made for the bankruptcy, reveals his wide-ranging interests: paintings by Italian masters and Flemish contemporaries, prints and drawings, armour and weapons, shells and minerals, musical instruments, busts of Roman emperors, exotic animals preserved. This collection represented both genuine intellectual curiosity and the desire to display wealth and learning. It also represented the same speculative acquisitiveness that drove merchants. Buying art could be investment as well as appreciation. After bankruptcy, Rembrandt continued to paint, producing some of his greatest works in his final years, but his circumstances were diminished. He relied on his companion Hendrik Stoffels and his son Titus to manage his affairs and protect him from creditors. His late paintings show a deepening inwardness, self-portraits that gaze at the viewer with unflinching honesty, religious scenes painted with profound empathy. The relationship between his art and his financial troubles is unknowable, but his late work has a depth that perhaps comes from suffering and humility. The art market that sustained and destroyed Rembrandt was remarkably developed. Dealers specialised in particular types of paintings. Some handled landscapes, others still lifes, others portraits. They maintained inventories, cultivated relationships with artists and collectors, understood market trends. When a wealthy merchant died, his collection might be auctioned, with dealers and collectors bidding. These auctions established market prices and redistributed art among the city's wealthy. Artists themselves organised their production with commercial awareness. Many worked on speculation, producing paintings without specific commissions and selling them through dealers or markets. Successful artists ran workshops with apprentices and assistants, essentially small businesses producing art efficiently. The workshop system allowed greater production, but also raised questions about authenticity and quality. How much of a painting attributed to a master was actually painted by the master versus assistants? Still life paintings, particularly popular among Dutch collectors, showed the goods that Amsterdam's trade brought: Chinese porcelain, Turkish carpets, German metalwork, Italian glassware, tropical fruits, exotic shells. These paintings celebrated global trade while also serving as memento mori, reminders of mortality and the transience of material wealth. A still life might show luxurious objects alongside symbols of decay. Wilting flowers, rotting fruit, extinguished candles. The message was that wealth and beauty are temporary, that death comes to all. Beyond painting, Amsterdam's prosperity supported other arts. The printing industry flourished. Amsterdam's presses produced books in many languages: Latin, Dutch, French, English, Hebrew. Religious tolerance meant that books banned elsewhere could be printed in Amsterdam. Controversial philosophical and theological works, maps and scientific texts, novels and poetry, all found publishers in Amsterdam. The Bleo family ran one of Amsterdam's most successful printing firms. They were particularly renowned for their maps and atlases. Joan Bleo's Atlas Maya, published in 1662 in 11 volumes, was the largest and most expensive book published in the 17th century. It contained nearly 600 maps and over 3,000 pages of text. A complete set cost hundreds of guilders, affordable only to the very wealthy, but it was spectacular, a monument to geographical knowledge and printing craftsmanship. Maps weren't just decorative, they were tools of commerce and navigation. Dutch ships needed accurate charts. Merchants needed maps showing trade routes and territories. The VOC commissioned maps of Asian waters, information that was commercially valuable and sometimes kept secret. The map trade linked science, art and commerce. Maps needed to be accurate. But they were also beautiful objects that wealthy collectors displayed. Scientific instruments were another Amsterdam specialty. Lens grinding was practiced with exceptional skill. The microscope and telescope, both developed in the Netherlands in the early 1600s, required high-quality lenses. Dutch craftsmen produced lenses that were the best in Europe, enabling scientific discoveries while also serving as luxury goods that demonstrated technical sophistication. Antony van Leeuwenhoek, though based in Delft, exemplified the connection between craft and science. He was a tradesman, a fabric merchant and surveyor, not a formally educated scientist. But he ground lenses with extraordinary precision and built simple microscopes that achieved magnifications no one else could match. Using these instruments, he observed bacteria, blood cells, sperm cells, entire worlds invisible to the naked eye. His discoveries, communicated to the Royal Society in London, revolutionized biology. Leeuwenhoek's work shows how Amsterdam's commercial culture supported science. The skills developed for commercial purposes, lens grinding for eyeglasses and navigational instruments, could be turned to scientific investigation. The wealth that trade generated allowed people time to pursue curiosity. The networks of correspondence that merchants used for business could share scientific observations and ideas. Baruch Spinoza, born in Amsterdam in 1632 to Portuguese Jewish parents, made his living grinding lenses while developing one of the most radical philosophical systems of the 17th century. Spinoza argued that God and nature were identical, that everything that exists is part of a single substance, that free will is an illusion, that religious texts should be studied historically rather than as divine revelation. These ideas were profoundly controversial, heretical by both Jewish and Christian standards. Spinoza was excommunicated from Amsterdam's Jewish community in 1656 for his unorthodox views. He lived modestly, supporting himself through lens grinding, refusing offers of academic positions that would have required conforming to orthodox beliefs. He wrote philosophy that was published anonymously or posthumously, circulating among intellectuals in manuscript. Amsterdam's relative tolerance allowed him to live and work, though even Amsterdam's tolerance had limits. His most radical work, The Ethics, wasn't published until after his death in 1677. The fact that Spinoza could live in Amsterdam, could earn a living through skilled craft, could develop and share radical ideas, speaks to the city's unusual character. A less tolerant city would have forced him to recant or flee. A less prosperous city wouldn't have had the commercial infrastructure that allowed lens grinding to support a philosopher. Amsterdam's combination of prosperity, tolerance, and intellectual culture created spaces for people who didn't fit conventional categories. The city's prosperity also funded public works and institutions. The new town hall, begun in 1648, was an architectural statement of Amsterdam's importance. It was massive, built on 13,659 wooden piles, driven into the marshy ground to support the structure. The interior was decorated with sculptures and paintings celebrating Amsterdam's commerce and civic virtues. The building served practical purposes, housing the city government, the Wisselbank, the courts, but it was also symbolic, announcing that Amsterdam had arrived as a great city. Education received support from merchant wealth. The Atheneum Illustre, founded in 1632, provided higher education in Amsterdam. It wasn't a full university, that distinction belonged to Leiden, but it offered instruction in philosophy, mathematics, medicine and law. Wealthy merchants endowed lectureships, supporting education that would produce skilled professionals and educated citizens. Charitable institutions also benefited from merchant philanthropy. Orphanages, hospitals, homes for the elderly. These were funded through combinations of civic resources and private donations. Wealthy merchants left bequests to charitable institutions in their wills, endowing them with ongoing support. This charity was partly religious. Calvinist belief emphasized stewardship and responsibility for the less fortunate, but it was also social, creating a safety net that maintained social stability. The relationship between wealth and culture in Amsterdam was direct and untroubled. Merchants weren't embarrassed about their money or apologetic about display. They commissioned portraits showing themselves in fine clothes with symbols of their trade. They built beautiful houses and filled them with art and objects that demonstrated taste and learning. They supported artists, publishers and craftsmen whose work both served commerce and transcended it. This integration of commerce and culture was distinctively Dutch, or at least distinctively Amsterdam. In many European societies, the landed aristocracy was culturally dominant, and merchants were seen as inferior regardless of their wealth. In Amsterdam, merchants were the elite. They governed the city, set cultural standards, and patronized the arts. There was no aristocracy to look down on them, no court culture they had to defer to. The culture they created reflected their values: practical, prosperous, learned without being pedantic, beautiful without being frivolous. The Golden Age paintings that now hang in museums and command enormous prices were, in their time, commodities produced for a market. Artists needed to eat. They needed to sell paintings. They responded to market demand, producing the subjects and styles that buyers wanted. But market demand didn't prevent artistic achievement. The constraints of commerce, the need to please buyers, to work within conventions, to price competitively, somehow generated extraordinary creativity. Perhaps the constraint was productive. Artists couldn't rely on a single wealthy patron's whims. They had to appeal to a broader market, had to find ways to make their work distinctive while remaining saleable. This pushed them toward innovation within accepted forms. A landscape had to be recognizably a landscape, but it could show light or atmosphere or composition in new ways. A portrait had to flatter the sitter, but it could also reveal character or capture a moment of genuine humanity. The culture of Amsterdam's Golden Age wasn't separate from commerce. It was embedded in commerce, funded by commerce, celebrated commerce, and used the tools and skills that commerce developed. The merchant counting his money in his house on the Herengracht, the artist painting in a studio nearby, the lens grinder creating instruments of precision, the printer producing maps of distant lands. They were all part of the same system, the same prosperous, innovative, confident world that Amsterdam had become. As the 1600s progressed, Amsterdam's cultural achievements became part of its identity and its legacy. Long after the city's commercial dominance would fade, the paintings and buildings and ideas would remain. testament to a moment when wealth and creativity aligned, when a small city on waterlogged land became not just a financial capital, but a capital of human achievement in all its forms. Amsterdam's prosperity and cultural achievements in the mid-1600s were built on foundations that seemed secure: dominance of the carrying trade, the VOC's control of Asian commerce. The Wisselbanks trusted money, the exchange's sophisticated markets, but no dominance lasts forever. Even as Amsterdam reached its peak, rival cities were learning from Dutch innovations, and circumstances that had favoured the Dutch were beginning to shift. The relationship between Amsterdam and other European commercial centres was complex, mixing cooperation and competition. Antwerp, just 80 miles to the south, had been the dominant trading city of northwestern Europe in the early 1500s, but Antwerp's fortune was tied to the southern Netherlands, which remained under Spanish control. When Spanish forces recaptured Antwerp in 1585 during the Dutch Revolt, the city's Protestant merchants fled north, many to Amsterdam. The Spanish then closed the Scheldt River, Antwerp's access to the sea, strangling the city's trade. Amsterdam's rise and Antwerp's decline were connected. The merchants, capital, and expertise that fled Antwerp enriched Amsterdam. The trade that had flowed through Antwerp shifted north. By 1600, Amsterdam had clearly surpassed its rival. Antwerp remained a substantial city, but it was no longer the commercial heart of northern Europe. That role had passed to Amsterdam, and Antwerp wouldn't recover it for centuries. But another rival was emerging that would prove more formidable: London. England in the early 1600s was less commercially developed than the Netherlands. English merchants traded certainly, but England lacked the sophisticated financial infrastructure, the massive merchant fleet, the global trading networks that Amsterdam had built. English ships were less efficient than Dutch fleets. English trade was smaller in volume. London's financial markets were primitive compared to Amsterdam's exchange. The English understood this and envied it. They looked at Dutch prosperity and wanted to replicate it. The English East India Company, chartered in 1600, was explicitly modelled on Dutch precedents, though it initially lacked the VOC's scale and capital. English merchants studied Dutch ship designs, Dutch trading practices, Dutch financial methods. England was learning from the Netherlands, gradually building capabilities that would eventually challenge Dutch dominance. The relationship between England and the Dutch Republic moved between cooperation and conflict. Both were Protestant powers, natural allies against Catholic Spain and France. They traded with each other extensively. Dutch refugees had settled in England, bringing skills and knowledge. English Protestants had found refuge in the Netherlands. The ruling families were connected. Later, William of Orange would marry the English Princess Mary and eventually become King of England as William III. But cooperation coexisted with commercial rivalry that sometimes turned violent. The root of conflict was competition for trade. English merchants resented Dutch dominance of the carrying trade. They particularly resented Dutch ships carrying goods between English ports and the continent, inserting themselves as middlemen in England's own commerce. England's response was legislative, the Navigation Acts. The first Navigation Act, passed by Parliament in 1651, required that goods imported to England be carried either in English ships or in ships from the country where the goods originated. This was aimed directly at Dutch carriers. A Dutch ship could no longer carry French wine or Baltic grain to England. Those goods had to come in French or Baltic ships, or in English ships. The goal was to build up England's merchant fleet at Dutch expense. The Dutch saw the Navigation Acts as economic warfare. Amsterdam's merchants protested. Diplomatic negotiations failed to resolve the conflict. In 1652, war broke out. The First Anglo-Dutch War. It was primarily a naval war, fought in the North Sea and the English Channel, disrupting trade and costing both sides substantially. The war wasn't catastrophic for Amsterdam, but it was expensive and disruptive. Trade routes were dangerous. insurance rates rose, some ships were lost to combat. The cost of maintaining naval forces strained the Republic's finances. When peace came in 1654, the Dutch had defended themselves but hadn't eliminated the English threat. The Navigation Acts remained in place. A second Anglo-Dutch war followed in 1665 to 1667, again over commercial rivalries and colonial competition. This war saw some of the largest naval battles of the age, with fleets of dozens of ships engaging in the North Sea. The 4 days battle in June 1666 involved over 200 ships and thousands of casualties. The war was costly and destructive for both sides, though the Dutch scored some notable successes, including a daring raid on the Medway in June 1667, when Dutch ships sailed up the River Thames and burned English warships at anchor. The Second Anglo-Dutch War ended with the Treaty of Breda in 1667. The settlement was mixed. The Dutch kept some colonial gains, the English others. The Navigation Acts remained. Neither side had decisively won. The wars demonstrated that the Dutch couldn't be easily defeated, but also that they faced a rival with substantial resources and determination. A third Anglo-Dutch War came in 1672 to 1674, but this time the context was different and the threat to the Dutch Republic more existential. France, under Louis XIV, invaded the Netherlands from the south. French armies swept through the southern provinces, occupying city after city. Simultaneously, England attacked by sea. The Dutch faced a two-front war against the two most powerful kingdoms in Europe. The year 1672 became known in Dutch history as the Rampjaar, the disaster year. French armies advanced within miles of Amsterdam. The Dutch responded desperately by opening dikes and flooding their own countryside, creating water barriers that slowed the French advance. The tactic worked. The French couldn't cross the flooded lands. And their advance stalled, but it showed how vulnerable the Dutch Republic was to military pressure from larger neighbours. The political crisis was as severe as the military one. The Republican government, led by Grand Pensionary Johan de Witt, was blamed for the disasters. De Witt and his brother Cornelis were murdered by a mob in The Hague in August 1672, their bodies mutilated in an outburst of rage and fear. William III of Orange, then just 21 years old, became stadtholder and took control of the Republic's military and political leadership. William eventually negotiated peace with England in 1674, splitting the Franco-English alliance. The war with France continued until 1678, draining Dutch resources. When peace finally came, the Dutch Republic had survived, but the cost was enormous. The Republic's finances were damaged. Trade had been disrupted for years. The sense of security that had existed in the earlier 1600s was shattered. These wars with England and France had long-term economic consequences. The cost of defending the Republic required higher taxes. Dutch merchants had to bear these costs, reducing their competitive advantage. English merchants, whose government was investing heavily in building England's fleet and protecting English trade, became more competitive. The gap in efficiency that had made Dutch shipping dominant began to narrow. London was also developing its financial institutions, learning from Amsterdam's example, but adapting to English circumstances. Goldsmiths in London had begun functioning as banks, accepting deposits and making loans. After the Glorious Revolution of 1688, when William of Orange became King of England, English financial development accelerated. The Bank of England was founded in 1694, explicitly modelled on the Amsterdam Wissel Bank but with important differences. The Bank of England was a private corporation, not a municipal institution. It was founded with the explicit purpose of lending to the English government to finance wars. In exchange for a large loan to the Crown, the bank received a charter giving it privileges, including the right to issue banknotes. These notes circulated as money, creating a flexible money supply that could expand to meet demand. This was different from the Amsterdam model, where bank money was strictly tied to metal reserves. The English model proved effective for financing government, particularly military spending. England could borrow at lower interest rates than rivals because lenders trusted the Bank of England and the English government's ability to repay. This quote "for in England" gave the English state fiscal capacity that exceeded what the Dutch Republic could raise through its more decentralised system. The VOC, meanwhile, was facing its own challenges. The initial decades of spectacular profits had given way to more modest returns by the mid-1600s. The company faced increasing competition from the English East India Company and from other European rivals. The costs of maintaining fortifications, armies, and administrative apparatus in Asia were enormous. Corruption among VOC officials reduced profits that should have returned to Amsterdam. The company paid dividends intermittently, sometimes in kind rather than cash, and shareholders began to question the company's management. The VOC's share price, which had reached peaks of over 500% of par value in the early 1600s, fluctuated more in the later decades. It remained a valuable security, and trading in VOC shares continued actively, but the sense that the VOC was an unstoppable profit machine faded. The company was a mature enterprise with all the challenges that maturity brings: bureaucracy, inertia, difficulty in adapting to changing circumstances. The Baltic grain trade, another pillar of Amsterdam's prosperity, also became more competitive. English, French, and Scandinavian ships increasingly carried their own goods rather than hiring Dutch vessels. The absolute volume of trade through Amsterdam remained large, but the Dutch share of the carrying trade declined gradually. The competitive advantage that the fleet had provided diminished as other nations built similar ships and reduced their operating costs. Amsterdam remained prosperous through the late 1600s, but the trajectory had changed. Instead of rapid growth and increasing dominance, there was stabilisation and, in some sectors, slow decline. The city was still wealthy, still important, still the most sophisticated financial centre in Europe. But it was no longer pulling further ahead of rivals. Instead, rivals were catching up. The shift wasn't sudden or catastrophic. There was no single moment when Amsterdam ceased to be the financial capital of Europe. Instead, over decades, the balance gradually tilted. London's markets grew larger and more active. English ships carried more cargo. The Bank of England's innovations in government finance created new instruments that attracted investors. The English government's support for trade and empire building gave English merchants advantages that Dutch merchants, operating with less state backing, couldn't match. There were also deeper structural factors at work. The Dutch Republic was small, with a population of perhaps 2 million in the mid-1600s. England had over 5 million people. France perhaps 20 million. As these larger states organised their economies more effectively, the Dutch couldn't match their absolute scale. Dutch advantage had come from superior efficiency and organisation. As rivals became more efficient and organised, the population difference mattered more. The republican political structure that had served Amsterdam well also had limitations. Decision-making in the Republic was decentralised, with each province and major city having substantial autonomy. This made it difficult to coordinate national policy, to make the kind of strategic decisions that a centralised monarchy could make quickly. The rivalry between the Orange Stadtholder faction and the Republican Regent faction created political instability. The disasters of 1672 had shown how vulnerable the Republic was to crisis. Amsterdam's merchants understood that their dominance was being challenged. Some adapted by diversifying, investing in English or other foreign ventures, moving capital to where opportunities were best. Others focused on the sectors where Amsterdam retained advantages: certain luxury trades, the spice trade through the VOC, financial services for an international clientele. The city remained a crucial financial centre because of accumulated expertise, trusted institutions, and network effects that couldn't be quickly replicated elsewhere. But the sense of inevitable Dutch commercial supremacy was gone. By the late 1600s, informed observers recognised that power was shifting. London was rising. Amsterdam would remain important, but it wouldn't dominate the way it had in the early to mid-1600s. The Golden Age, while not over, had reached its peak and was beginning a long, gradual decline. This shift wasn't because Amsterdam failed, but because success itself created challenges. The Dutch had proved that certain ways of organising commerce and finance were extremely effective. They demonstrated that republican government could support prosperity. They'd shown that tolerance and openness attracted talent and capital. These lessons were learned by rivals who then applied them in context with larger populations and more natural resources. There's a pattern here that recurs in economic history. The innovator gains advantage, prospers, and attracts imitation. Rivals copy what works, often improving upon it. The initial advantage erodes as innovations diffuse. Unless the innovator continues to innovate, competitors catch up and may surpass. Amsterdam continued to innovate in some areas, but the fundamental innovations, the Vloot, the joint stock company, the exchange bank, the stock market, had already happened. Later generations operated these systems competently, but didn't revolutionize them the way earlier generations had. The comparison with Venice is instructive. Venice had been the dominant commercial power of the Mediterranean for centuries before Amsterdam's rise. By the 1600s, Venice was in decline, its trade diminishing, its power fading. Amsterdam was aware of this parallel. Dutch merchants didn't want to follow Venice into irrelevance. The forces that had eroded Venice's position, changing trade routes, rising rivals, the limits of city-state power in a world of nation-states, were beginning to affect Amsterdam too. As we moved toward the end of the 1600s, Amsterdam remained a beautiful, wealthy, culturally vibrant city. The canal still reflected elegant house fronts. The exchange still bustled with traders. Ships still arrived from across the world. The Whistlebank still facilitated trade. But the relative position was changing. Amsterdam was no longer uniquely dominant. It was one important financial centre among several, still preeminent perhaps, but challenged by London and increasingly aware that the future might belong to larger, more powerful rivals. The story of Amsterdam's financial dominance in the 1600s is thus a story with a beginning, a peak, and the start of a long decline. The innovations that created that dominance in ships, finance, institutions, culture were real and transformative. They shaped capitalism and continue to influence how we organise economic life. But dominance itself proved temporary, as it always does, giving way to new centres and new arrangements that built on what Amsterdam had pioneered. Amsterdam's time as the unquestioned financial capital of the world was finite, measured in decades rather than centuries, but what Amsterdam created during those decades has proven remarkably enduring. The innovations that emerged from the practical needs of Dutch merchants in the early 1600s became the foundations of modern capitalism, spreading across Europe and eventually across the world, shaping how we organise economic life to this day. Consider the joint stock company with permanent capital, the structure the VOC pioneered in 1602. Before the VOC, business partnerships were typically temporary, formed for specific ventures and dissolved when those ventures concluded. This worked well enough for local trade or short-term projects, but it created problems for enterprises requiring sustained capital investment over years or decades. The VOC's solution, capital that remained permanently with the company, with investors able to exit by selling shares rather than by demanding their capital back, solved this problem elegantly. The model spread quickly. The English East India Company, chartered in 1600, initially operated on a voyage-by-voyage basis, but it reorganised along permanent capital lines in 1657, explicitly copying the Dutch model. The French established their own East India Company in 1664. Other trading companies followed the pattern. By the late 1600s, the joint stock company with permanent capital was recognized as the proper structure for large commercial enterprises requiring sustained investment. This organizational form enabled ventures that would have been impossible under earlier structures. You could build infrastructure, docks, warehouses, fortifications, knowing the capital would remain available for maintenance and expansion. You could plan long-term, making investments that might not pay off for years. You could grow to enormous scale by raising capital from thousands of investors rather than depending on a few wealthy partners. The modern corporation, the dominant form of business organization worldwide, descends directly from this Dutch innovation. When we see companies with millions of shareholders, with stock traded on global exchanges, with permanent existence independent of any individual owner's participation, we're seeing the legacy of what Amsterdam's merchants created in the early 1600s. They were solving a practical problem of how to fund Asian trade, but they invented an institution that would reshape capitalism. The stock market itself, the secondary market where shares trade hands, emerged from the VOC's permanent capital structure. Once shares couldn't be redeemed by the company, a market for trading them became necessary. The Amsterdam Exchange provided the physical space, but the practices of stock trading, price discovery through supply and demand, speculation on future values, financial instruments like short sales and options, developed organically through merchants' activities. London's Stock Exchange, which would eventually surpass Amsterdam's, was founded in 1698 and explicitly modelled on Amsterdam's practices. The London traders used Dutch techniques, Dutch terminology, Dutch methods. Paris established its bourse in 1724. Other European cities followed. The practices pioneered in Amsterdam, daily trading sessions, specialised brokers, published price lists, rules for settling trades, became standard across Europe. The financial instruments that seem modern and sophisticated, futures contracts, options, short selling, margin buying, all existed in Amsterdam by the mid-1600s. Joseph de la Vega's descriptions from 1688 show traders using strategies that would be familiar to any modern stock trader. The terminology has changed, the technology has transformed, the scale has increased enormously, but the fundamental concepts remain recognisably similar to what Amsterdam's merchants practiced. Central banking, too, owes debts to Amsterdam. The Wissel Bank's innovation of creating standardised ledger money backed by metal reserves, providing payment services separate from lending, maintaining transparency about reserves, these became principles that later central banks adopted and adapted. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, learned from the Wissel Bank's example even as it developed in different directions suited to English circumstances. The Wissel Bank's eventual failure, in the late 1700s, when the bank secretly lent its reserves to the VOC and the city government and couldn't meet redemption demands when the financial crisis hit, provided a different kind of a lesson about the importance of maintaining the separation between reserve banking and lending, about transparency, about the dangers of governments exploiting monetary institutions for fiscal purposes. These negative lessons were as important as the positive ones in shaping later central bank design. The concept that money could exist primarily as ledger entries, as abstract units of account rather than physical objects, was radical in 1609 when the Wissel Bank opened. We take it entirely for granted now. The vast majority of money in modern economies exists as electronic entries in computer systems, exactly the same in principle as the Wissel Bank's handwritten ledger entries. The technology has changed, but the fundamental concept that money can be information rather than stuff was pioneered in Amsterdam. Amsterdam's approach to markets, the understanding that markets could function with minimal regulation if participants had proper incentives and reputational stakes, influenced how financial markets developed elsewhere. The exchange operated mostly through informal rules and social enforcement. Formal regulation was minimal. This worked because the merchant community was relatively small and tightly connected, because reputation mattered, because exclusion from the exchange meant exclusion from profitable trade. As markets grew larger and more impersonal, this informal model became inadequate, requiring more formal regulation and enforcement. But the default assumption in financial market design remained that markets should be largely self-regulating, with government intervention limited to establishing basic rules and preventing fraud. This assumption, derived from Amsterdam's experience, has been repeatedly challenged and debated but remains influential in how we think about financial regulation. The relationship between financial innovation and economic growth that Amsterdam demonstrated also became a lasting lesson. Amsterdam showed that sophisticated financial markets could mobilize capital, allocate it efficiently, spread risk, and thereby enable economic activities that wouldn't otherwise occur. The ships that sailed to the Indies, the infrastructure that drained the polders, the houses that lined the canals, all were financed through Amsterdam's financial innovations. This connection between finance and growth became central to economic development thinking. Countries seeking to develop economically looked to their financial systems, understanding that commerce needed capital and that capital needed institutions to mobilize and allocate it. Whether these institutions should be modelled on Amsterdam's market-based approach or on alternative models, state-directed banking, community-based credit, has been debated, but Amsterdam demonstrated that finance mattered for economic development. Amsterdam's cultural legacy, the golden age of Dutch painting and learning, showed that commerce and culture could be mutually reinforcing rather than antagonistic. The wealth generated by trade-funded art and science. The social structure created by merchant dominance produced a culture that celebrated both material prosperity and intellectual achievement. This wasn't the patronage model of Italian city-states, where wealthy families sponsored artists and scholars. It was a market model where artists produced for buyers and scholars found support from diverse sources. This integration of commerce and culture became characteristic of modern capitalist societies. The assumption that economic prosperity enables cultural flourishing, that markets can support art and science, that wealth and learning naturally go together, these ideas, so common in modern thinking, were demonstrated and validated by Amsterdam's golden age. The Dutch tolerance for diversity, motivated partly by principle, but also by practical recognition that diversity brought economic benefits, provided another enduring lesson. Amsterdam prospered partly because it welcomed refugees, Jews from Iberia, Protestants from Catholic countries, merchants from Antwerp. These refugees brought skills, capital, connections, and ideas that enriched Amsterdam. The lesson that openness and tolerance can be economically advantageous, that diversity strengthens rather than weakens commercial societies, has been influential in shaping immigration and integration policies. Of course, this tolerance had clear limits. It applied primarily to people who could contribute economically. It didn't extend to challenging the fundamental commercial and political order. It coexisted with brutal exploitation in Dutch colonies. The Dutch tolerance was pragmatic rather than principled, instrumental rather than idealistic. But even imperfect tolerance demonstrated that religious and ethnic diversity could coexist with social stability and economic prosperity. A significant lesson in an age of religious wars and persecution. The physical legacy of Amsterdam's golden age remains visible today. The canal belt, the elegant merchant houses, the town hall that became the royal palace, the churches and warehouses, these buildings still stand, still shape Amsterdam's identity. Walking along the Herengracht or Keizersgracht today, you see essentially the same streetscape that merchants would have seen in the mid-1600s. The city preserved its historic core even as it modernized, maintaining physical continuity with its past. The paintings that hung in merchant houses have dispersed to museums worldwide, but they remain Amsterdam's cultural ambassadors, shaping how the world understands Dutch civilization. Rembrandt and Vermeer are among the most famous artists in history. Their paintings are among the most valuable and treasured cultural artifacts humanity possesses. They were products of Amsterdam's commercial culture, and they represent that culture to subsequent generations. The ideas developed in Amsterdam also spread, not just financial and commercial practices, but philosophical and scientific approaches. Spinoza's rationalist philosophy influenced the Enlightenment. Dutch achievements in optics, cartography, and navigation contributed to scientific progress. The Dutch tradition of republican government, of civic autonomy and constitutional limits on power, influenced political thinking in England, America, and France. When the American founders designed their constitution, they looked partly to Dutch republican precedents. The States General, the federal structure balancing provincial autonomy with collective action, the resistance to monarchical power, these aspects of Dutch political organisation informed American thinking about how republics could function. The influence was indirect and mixed with other traditions, but Amsterdam and the Dutch Republic provided a working model of republican government in an age of monarchies. The decline of Amsterdam's relative position in the 18th and 19th centuries doesn't diminish what was achieved in the 1600s. Dominance is always temporary. What matters is whether innovations persist beyond the innovator's dominance. Amsterdam's innovations did persist. They spread, adapted, evolved, but remained recognizable. The financial capitalism that developed in London, New York, and other centres was built on foundations that Amsterdam laid. There's something profound about how a small city, built on unpromising marshy land, inhabited by a people with no natural resources except ingenuity and determination, became the centre of global commerce and finance. Amsterdam's rise wasn't inevitable. It required the convergence of geography, technology, institutions, culture, and historical circumstance. The Dutch faced the sea and learned to manage water. They fought for independence and created republican institutions. They innovated in shipbuilding and commerce. They built financial institutions that enabled new scales of enterprise. Other cities had some of these elements, but not all. Venice had maritime traditions, but not the institutional innovations. Antwerp had commercial sophistication, but lost independence. London had size and resources, but developed its institutions later. Amsterdam combined elements in a particular way at a particular moment, creating something unprecedented. The question of whether Amsterdam's example can be replicated, whether other cities or countries can follow a similar path to prosperity, has preoccupied development economists and policymakers. The answer seems to be both yes and no. Yes, the specific innovations, joint stock companies, stock markets, central banks, tolerance for diversity, can be copied and have been copied successfully in many contexts. But no, the particular combination of circumstances that made Amsterdam dominant can't be exactly replicated because circumstances change. What can be learned from Amsterdam is that institutions matter enormously, that innovation in institutional design can be as important as technological innovation, that openness and tolerance can be economically advantageous, that finance properly structured can enable growth, that small places can achieve disproportionate influence through superior organisation. These are lessons, not blueprints. They must be adapted to different contexts rather than copied mechanically. Amsterdam's story also teaches humility about dominance. The Dutch merchants who thought Amsterdam's position was secure, who perhaps assumed that advantages built over decades would persist indefinitely, learned that rivals could catch up, that innovations could be copied, that circumstances could change. The shift from Amsterdam to London wasn't because Amsterdam failed, but because London learned and grew. Success creates imitators, and imitators eventually succeed. This pattern, innovator gains advantage, prospers, attracts imitation, loses relative position as innovations diffuse, has repeated throughout economic history. Britain dominated the 19th century as the workshop of the world, then faced American and German challengers. America dominated the 20th century, now faces Chinese and other competition. The pattern suggests that dominance is inherently temporary, that the goal isn't to maintain eternal supremacy, but to continue adapting and innovating. Amsterdam itself continued as a significant financial centre long after its dominance faded. The city remained wealthy, cultured, important. Dutch banks and corporations remained significant in global finance and trade. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange merged with others to form Euronext, one of Europe's major exchange groups. The city's historic connection to finance and trade persists in modern form, but the relative position had changed permanently. By the 18th century, London was clearly the dominant financial centre. By the 20th century, New York had arguably surpassed London. Amsterdam was one important centre among several. Influential but not dominant. This isn't failure. Cities and nations can prosper without dominating, but it represents a change from the 1600s when Amsterdam had no peer. The legacy Amsterdam left is ultimately about possibility. A small place with few natural advantages can become a centre of global influence through innovation, organisation, and openness. Finance can enable prosperity rather than simply extracting from it. Markets can organise economic activity efficiently if properly structured. Culture and commerce can reinforce rather than oppose each other. These possibilities, demonstrated by Amsterdam in the 1600s, remain relevant and inspiring. When we look at financial markets today, at global corporations, at central banks and stock exchanges, at the infrastructure of modern capitalism, we're seeing the distant descendants of institutions that Dutch merchants created to solve practical problems of trade and finance. They weren't trying to design the future of capitalism. They were trying to buy spices, ship grain, manage currency chaos, raise capital for trading voyages. But their practical solutions turned out to have universal applicability to address problems that all commercial societies face. Amsterdam's moment as the financial capital of the world lasted perhaps 70 or 80 years, from the early 1600s to the late 1600s, before London began its rise. Not long in historical terms, but in that relatively brief period, Amsterdam's merchants invented or perfected institutions and practices that would shape economic life for centuries. That achievement, measured not in temporal dominance but in lasting influence, remains Amsterdam's most significant legacy, the reason why this small city's story matters far beyond its time and place. And so, we've travelled together through Amsterdam's canals, through its counting houses and exchanges, through the minds of merchants who built something from almost nothing. We've watched a city rise from waterlogged land to become the centre of the world's commerce, not through conquest or natural wealth, but through ingenuity, through organisation, through the patient work of building systems that served human needs. Picture Amsterdam now as evening settles over the Herengracht. The canal reflects the sky's fading light. Inside the narrow houses, lamps are being lit. Merchants close their ledgers for the day. The exchange is quiet, empty until tomorrow. Ships rock gently at their moorings, waiting for morning tide. The city that invented so much of our modern world rests, as you should rest. The innovations we've explored, the stock market, the corporation, the central bank, weren't grand visions imposed from above. They were practical solutions to everyday problems, created by people trying to make commerce work more smoothly. That's how progress often happens, not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through patient problem solving, through countless small improvements that accumulate into transformation. You're part of that same story, that long human project of building and creating and solving. The merchants of Amsterdam didn't know they were inventing the future. They were just doing their work day by day, trade by trade. Rest now in that continuity, in the knowledge that human creativity and determination persist across centuries. Let the canal water lap gently against the stones. Let the image of Amsterdam at twilight settle in your mind. Peaceful, beautiful, complete, sleep well, dream of calm waters reflecting light. Good night.